Before the emperor, the world that China inherited. There is a particular kind of silence that belongs to old places. Not the silence of an empty room or a forest after snowfall, but the deeper silence of a landscape that has watched generations disappear. A river continues to move. Grass continues to grow. Mountains remain in the distance, indifferent and patient. Somewhere beneath the soil, the foundations of a house are slowly becoming dust. And if you were standing beside the Yellow River more than 2,000 years ago, before there was an emperor of all China, you might have heard much the same things that people hear there now. Water moving over stones, wind passing through reeds, the distant sound of carts, perhaps a dog barking somewhere beyond the fields, perhaps the low voices of farmers returning home before darkness, and somewhere far away soldiers marching. Because the story of Imperial China begins long before the first emperor. It begins in a world where nobody yet knows that an empire is coming. A world of walled cities, bronze weapons, ancestral temples, muddy roads, horse-drawn chariots, ambitious rulers, frightened peasants, wandering philosophers, and small kingdoms that have spent generations trying to destroy one another. It is a world that feels strangely familiar. Everyone wants security. Everyone wants food. Everyone wants their children to survive. And naturally, every ruler would also like to become slightly more powerful than the ruler next door. Because apparently human beings have never been particularly good at leaving well enough alone. For centuries, the lands that would eventually become China were divided among competing states. These states fought, negotiated, married into one another's families, betrayed one another, and then fought again. This was the age later remembered as the Warring States period. And if you had lived through it, you probably would not have experienced it as a neat historical period with a convenient name. You would simply have known that war was part of life. You might have been a farmer living beside a river. In spring, you planted millet or wheat. In summer, you watched the sky for rain. In autumn, you harvested what you could. And in winter, you tried to stay warm. Then one morning, soldiers might arrive. Perhaps they belonged to your own state. Perhaps they belonged to another. It hardly mattered. They would need grain. They would need animals. They would need laborers to repair roads, carry supplies, build walls, dig trenches, and transport equipment. The great armies of the Warring States period were becoming larger and more organized than anything earlier rulers had been able to maintain. War was no longer simply a matter of nobles riding chariots into battle while everyone else watched. Peasants could be conscripted. Governments could count households. Taxes could be collected systematically. Officials could be appointed. Laws could be written and enforced. The ancient states were becoming something more formidable. They were becoming bureaucratic states. And one of these states was Qin. Qin occupied lands in the west, somewhat distant from the old political centers of the Central Plain. For a long time, the other states looked upon Qin as somewhat rough and provincial. That would turn out to be an unfortunate assumption. Qin had something extremely useful, a willingness to reorganize society around the needs of the state. Its rulers adopted reforms associated with the statesman Xiangyang, who believed that government should be strict, orderly, and relentlessly focused on strengthening military power. Families were organized into administrative units. Punishments could be severe. Old aristocratic privileges were weakened. Land could be redistributed. The government became deeply involved in the lives of ordinary people. It was not gentle. It was not particularly interested in being loved. But it was effective. And effectiveness, unfortunately, is one of those qualities that tends to survive. Over generations, Qin expanded. One neighboring kingdom fell, then another, then another. And at the center of this growing machine stood a young ruler named Zheng. He became king of Qin in 246 BCE. He was only 13 years old, which is perhaps not the age most of us would choose to begin running a kingdom. At 13, most people are still trying to understand why their parents are suddenly so embarrassing. Zheng, meanwhile, inherited a state that was already preparing for enormous war. For several years, Real political power was exercised by regents and powerful ministers. But eventually the young king took control. And once he did, his ambition became unmistakable. He wanted to conquer the other states, not merely defeat them, not merely collect tribute. He wanted to eliminate them. He wanted one realm, one ruler, one political order. The dream was extraordinary because for generations the Chinese world had been divided. People knew the idea of a unified realm from older traditions and myths. But the reality was another matter. The states had become powerful in their own right. Their rulers possessed armies, courts, traditions, and ambitions. To destroy them would require enormous resources. It would require patience. It would require logistics. And it would require a ruler who was willing to keep going long after a more cautious man might have stopped. Zheng was that ruler. Qin armies moved east. One state after another was conquered. Han fell first in 230 BCE. Zhao followed in 228, although resistance continued. Wei collapsed in 225. Chu, the Great Southern Kingdom, was defeated in 223 after a massive campaign. Yan followed. Then Qi. By 221 BCE, the old political map had disappeared. The kingdoms were gone, and the young king of Qin stood at the center of a unified realm. He was no longer satisfied with the ordinary title of king. Kings existed in other states. He needed something greater. He adopted the title Huangdi, emperor. The first emperor, Qin Shi Huang. And so, almost quietly, the imperial age began. There was no single moment when the landscape suddenly transformed. Farmers still planted their crops. Children still cried. Old men still complained about taxes. Women still carried water. Workers still walked home exhausted after long days. But above them, the political structure of the world had changed. The empire now stretched across enormous distances. And the first emperor intended to make sure it stayed together. This required roads. It required standardized measurements. It required standardized weights. It required a common writing system. It required currency. It required laws. It required officials who could administer distant territories. It required enormous construction projects. And it required an extraordinary amount of labor. The emperor's government became famous for its harshness. Men were conscripted. Communities were ordered to provide labor. Penalties were severe. The state demanded obedience. There is something almost eerie about imagining the empire during this period. Imagine walking along a road built under Qin authority. The road stretches toward the horizon. Dust hangs in the air. A group of laborers passes by carrying tools. A military convoy moves in the opposite direction. Officials ride past in carts. Somewhere, a messenger carries a document stamped with imperial authority. And everywhere there are measurements, lengths, weights, volumes, numbers. The empire is trying to turn a vast and complicated human landscape into something that can be counted. That was one of the great achievements of Qin. It was also one of its great dangers, because people are not numbers, and eventually the pressure became too much. But before that happened, the first emperor became obsessed with something much older than administration: death. Qin Shi Huang had conquered kingdoms. He had commanded armies. He had built palaces. He had ordered enormous walls and roads. He had achieved something that generations of rulers had failed to accomplish. But there was one enemy he could not defeat: time. As he grew older, the emperor became increasingly interested in finding an elixir of immortality. Alchemy, magic, medicine, mystical islands, foreign lands. Anything that might promise an escape from the ordinary fate of human beings. Perhaps somewhere beyond the sea there were immortal beings. Perhaps somewhere there existed a substance that could preserve the body forever. So expeditions were sent out. Ships sailed. Searchers traveled. And the emperor continued ruling. Meanwhile, another project was underway: a tomb. not a modest tomb, an underground world. The mausoleum near modern Xi'an would eventually become one of the most extraordinary archaeological sites on Earth. Thousands of workers were involved. The tomb complex contained palaces, gardens, rivers of mercury according to ancient accounts, and an enormous army of terracotta soldiers intended to accompany the emperor into the next world. Thousands of clay figures, infantrymen, archers, cavalry, officers, charioteers, horses, each face slightly different. Imagine the workshops, the smell of clay, the sound of tools, the endless repetition of labor. Another soldier, another horse, another figure, another piece of armor, another face, all for a man who feared that death might not respect imperial authority. And then, in 210 BCE, Qin Shi Huang died while traveling through his empire. He was about 50 years old. The first emperor had spent his life trying to impose permanence on the world. But his empire did not survive him for long. His successor was weaker. Court factions competed. Rebellions spread. The harshness of Qin rule had created enormous resentment. Farmers revolted. Local leaders gathered armies. The machinery that had unified the empire became a weapon turned against itself. And within only a few years, the Qing Dynasty was gone. It had lasted barely more than a decade as an empire. This seems almost absurd. A man conquers an entire world and then, very shortly afterward, the world falls apart again. But the Qin had left something behind. The idea of imperial unity. That idea would prove much harder to kill than the dynasty itself. The next great ruler would come not from the Qin royal family, but from a very different background. His name was Liu Bang. He had been born into a relatively humble family. He had not begun life as a prince. He was not raised to become emperor. But Liu Bang possessed something valuable. He understood people. He understood survival. He understood when to fight and when to wait. And as the Qin world collapsed, he gathered supporters. Another major leader emerged as his rival. Xiang Yu was younger, aristocratic, brilliant, and formidable. The struggle between Liu Bang and Xiang Yu would become one of the great stories of early Imperial China. Xiang Yu possessed military talent. Liu Bang possessed something perhaps even more useful: political patience. Their rivalry eventually ended with Xiang Yu defeated. Liu Bang became emperor. And in 202 BCE, the Han Dynasty began. The Han would last, with interruptions, for roughly 4 centuries. And in many ways, the Han established the basic pattern that would define Imperial China for the next 2,000 years. The emperor at the center, a vast bureaucracy beneath him, officials selected, appointed, promoted, and sometimes punished, taxes collected from farmers, armies guarding borders, historians recording events, Confucian thinkers explaining how rulers ought to behave, and ordinary people trying to get through the day without becoming involved in any of it. The Han rulers learned from Qin. That was important. They kept much of the Qin administrative machinery, but they softened some of its harshness. The state still demanded obedience, but now the language of government increasingly emphasized moral order. The emperor was not merely the strongest man in the empire. He was supposed to be the father of the realm, the son of heaven. His authority was connected to heaven itself, and this created a fascinating tension. The emperor possessed enormous power, but according to Confucian thought, power also created responsibility. A ruler who governed badly could lose heaven's approval. Natural disasters, famine, rebellion, and political chaos could be interpreted as signs that heaven was withdrawing its support. In theory, then, the emperor could be powerful without being arbitrary. In practice, well, human beings have always been remarkably talented at finding exceptions to their own principles. The Han Empire expanded. Its armies moved into Central Asia. Its rulers confronted powerful nomadic peoples to the north, particularly the Xiongnu. Trade routes stretched westward. Silk moved across deserts. Horses moved east. Ideas traveled. people traveled, and the Chinese world became increasingly connected to lands far beyond the Yellow River and the Yangtze. The emperor's court became a place of ceremony and intrigue. Imagine the capital at dawn, mist hanging over tiled roofs, courtiers entering gates, guards standing motionless, officials carrying documents, servants preparing food, the smell of incense drifting through halls. Outside the palace walls, the city is already awake. Merchants are arranging goods. Street vendors are preparing breakfast. Donkeys and carts squeeze through narrow streets. Children chase one another. Someone is already arguing over money. And somewhere inside the palace, a decision is being made that may affect millions of people who will never know the emperor's name. This was the peculiar nature of imperial government. The closer you were to the center, the more enormous the empire seemed. The farther away you were, the less real the emperor could feel. For a farmer living hundreds of miles from the capital, the empire might be experienced mostly through taxes. An official arrives. A notice is read. Grain is collected. Men are called for military service. And then the official leaves. The emperor remains an abstract figure. A name. A symbol. A distant presence. Yet the empire slowly becomes part of everyday life. Writing systems, administrative practices, calendars, roads, canals, legal traditions, Confucian education, all of these create a shared political culture. This is one of the great mysteries of Chinese history. How does such an enormous civilization remain recognizable across centuries? Dynasties rise and fall. Armies invade. Capitals move. Palaces burn. Languages change. Religions spread. And yet the idea of China continues. Part of the answer lies in geography. The great river systems create agricultural heartlands. The Yellow River in the north. The Yangtze farther south. Between them lie plains capable of supporting enormous populations. But geography alone is not enough. The political tradition matters. The memory of earlier dynasties matters. The written language matters. The bureaucracy matters. And perhaps most importantly, the belief that unity is normal matters. Division can happen. Indeed, division can last for generations. But somewhere in the background is the assumption that eventually someone will come along and put everything back together. That someone does not always succeed. But the dream remains. The Han Dynasty itself eventually began to weaken. Court factions became increasingly powerful. Powerful families accumulated land. Peasants struggled under taxation and debt. Officials competed for influence. And religious movements attracted people who believed the existing order had failed. In 184 CE, the Yellow Turban Rebellion erupted. His followers wore yellow head coverings and preached a vision of transformation. The rebellion was eventually suppressed. But the political system had been badly weakened. Generals became increasingly independent. Regional military commanders gained power. The central government struggled to control them. And eventually the Han collapsed. China entered another age of division. This time, however, something had changed. The idea of empire had become deeply rooted. The Han had lasted long enough to become more than a dynasty. It became a model. Later rulers would look backward toward the Han. Later scholars would celebrate Han achievements. And eventually the very word Han would become associated with the dominant ethnic identity of China. But for now, the empire was breaking apart. The old capital lost its authority. Generals fought. Regional kingdoms emerged. The country divided. The landscape once again filled with soldiers. And ordinary people once again learned the ancient rhythm of instability. Plant. Harvest. Hide. Run. Return. Repair. Begin again. The Three Kingdoms period would follow. It would become one of the most famous eras in Chinese storytelling. But the real experience was likely much less romantic. There were battles. Yes. There were brilliant commanders. Yes. There were legendary strategies, but beneath the legends were farms, villages, flooded fields, empty houses, families separated by military service, and people who had absolutely no interest in becoming characters in an epic. They simply wanted enough grain to survive winter. Eventually, after decades of division, the Western Qing Dynasty briefly reunited China. But the reunification was fragile. Nomadic peoples and frontier groups moved into northern China. Political struggles weakened the Qing court. Wars multiplied. The north fragmented again. The south became a refuge for elites, officials, farmers, and families fleeing the violence. For centuries, China would exist as several competing states. This period is sometimes called the Six Dynasties era. It is easy to imagine it as a dark interlude between great empires. But history rarely works that neatly. While governments fought, culture continued. Buddhism spread. New artistic traditions emerged. Poetry flourished. People moved. Ideas mixed. Northern and southern cultures interacted. New political identities formed. And slowly, beneath all this complexity, another reunification became possible. That reunification would come with the Sui dynasty. The Sui rulers were not interested in doing things halfway. The Emperor Yang Jian, known as Emperor Wen, reunified much of China in 589 CE. After centuries of fragmentation, a single government once again ruled the heartland. And then came one of the most ambitious infrastructure projects in Chinese history, the Grand Canal. Imagine it at night. A long ribbon of dark water beneath the moon, boats moving slowly, grain piled high, workers on the banks, lanterns flickering. The canal connected the agricultural wealth of the south with the political centers of the north. It was an extraordinary achievement. It was also enormously expensive, and this was becoming a recurring theme in Imperial China. The empire could build astonishing things, could organize millions of people, could construct roads, canals, walls, palaces, cities. But every achievement had a human cost. Taxes, labor, military service, and eventually resentment. The Sui dynasty expanded aggressively. Its rulers launched major campaigns against Korea. The campaigns failed. The costs were immense. Rebellion spread. The Sui collapsed. Again. A short-lived dynasty had unified China and then destroyed itself through ambition. And once again, another dynasty waited in the wings. This time, the dynasty would become one of the most celebrated in Chinese history, the Tang. In 618 CE, the Tang dynasty began, and for a while, the empire seemed almost unstoppable. The capital at Chang'an became one of the largest and most cosmopolitan cities in the world. Persians, Central Asians, Koreans, Japanese envoys, merchants, monks, diplomats, soldiers, poets, all passed through its gates. At night, lanterns illuminated streets. Music drifted from entertainment districts. Carriages moved through the city. The empire felt enormous, confident, rich, and very much alive. The Tang court became famous for culture, poetry, painting, music, religion, philosophy. But underneath the elegance was the same old machinery: taxes, land, armies, officials, and succession. Because sooner or later, every dynasty has to answer one extremely awkward question: who comes next? The Tang would eventually face that question in spectacular fashion. But before the decline, there would be one of the most fascinating figures in Chinese history. A woman who would become emperor. Her name was Wu Zhao. History would remember her as Wu Zetian. She entered the imperial court as a concubine. She survived political struggles that destroyed others. She became empress, and eventually she ruled in her own name. For traditional historians, this was deeply uncomfortable. A woman occupying the throne? Scandalous. Dangerous. Impossible. Except that she did it. Wu Zetian understood the machinery of power. She used officials. She promoted talented men from outside established aristocratic families. She employed spies. She cultivated religious legitimacy. She built monuments. She presented herself as a ruler chosen by heaven. And for a time, she governed effectively. Her reign demonstrated something important. The imperial system was more flexible than it sometimes appeared. It could accommodate extraordinary individuals, but it could also be extremely cruel to those who stood in their way. Court politics in Imperial China could be lethal. A rival might disappear. An accusation might end a career. A family could lose everything. And all of this could happen quietly, behind painted walls and silk curtains. No battlefield. No screaming crowds. Just a sealed document. A whispered conversation. A messenger leaving before dawn. The empire's most dangerous battles were often fought without weapons. Eventually the Tang reached its height under Emperor Xuanzong. This was the age of Chang'an's brilliance. But perhaps no imperial golden age can remain golden forever. Xuanzong's reign eventually became dominated by court favorites and political complications. And then came the Lushan Rebellion in 755. It was one of the most devastating rebellions in Chinese history. And Lushan, a powerful military commander, rebelled against the Tang government. Armies moved toward the capital. The emperor fled. The empire descended into chaos. Cities were captured. People died. Agricultural systems were disrupted. The demographic losses associated with the rebellion were enormous, although precise figures remain debated. What mattered to people living through it was simpler. The world had become dangerous. The Tang survived. But it was never quite the same. Regional military commanders became powerful. The central government weakened. Taxes became harder to collect. The empire became increasingly fragmented. And by 907, the Tang Dynasty had fallen. Once again, China entered a period of division. Once again, kingdoms rose and disappeared. Once again, the dream of unity waited beneath the surface. This cycle would repeat again and again. Unity. Expansion. Prosperity. Pressure. Rebellion. Fragmentation. Then reunification. It is tempting to think of Imperial China as a single continuous thing. But perhaps it is better imagined as a great river, sometimes wide, sometimes narrow, sometimes divided into channels, sometimes blocked by storms, yet always moving. The Song Dynasty emerged in 960, and the Song would transform China in ways that were not always obvious on a battlefield. The Song was not the largest empire China had ever seen. Its rulers faced powerful neighbors. But economically and technologically, the Song world was extraordinary. Cities grew. Markets expanded. Paper money appeared. Printing spread. Gunpowder technology developed. Commercial agriculture intensified. Ships traveled farther. Merchants became increasingly important. And ordinary urban life became more sophisticated. Imagine a Song city at night. Shops remain open. Tea is being prepared. Street vendors call to customers. Paper notices hang on walls. Books are being printed. Merchants count coins. Travelers search for inns. A scholar walks beneath lantern light carrying manuscripts. The city is noisy, crowded, bright, and surprisingly modern in some of its rhythms. But the Song faced an enormous strategic problem. To the north were powerful states. First the Liao, then the Western Xia, then the Jin, and eventually the Mongols. The Song could produce wealth, could produce technology, could produce administrators, scholars, engineers, merchants, and ships. But military pressure never disappeared. Then, from the northern steppes came a force that would change the entire history of Eurasia. The Mongols. Genghis Khan united Mongol tribes. His successors built an empire that stretched across vast territories. Northern China fell. The Qing Dynasty was destroyed, and eventually the Mongol ruler Kublai Khan completed the conquest of the Song. In 1271, Kublai declared the Yuan Dynasty. By 1279, the Song had finally been defeated. For the first time, all of China was ruled by a dynasty established by conquerors from the steppe. The Mongols did not simply erase Chinese institutions. They adopted many of them. They governed through a mixture of Mongol traditions and Chinese administrative practices. The empire became connected to the wider Mongol world. Trade increased across Eurasia. Foreign travelers reached China. Among them was a Venetian merchant whose name would later become famous in Europe, Marco Polo. Whether every detail of his account is accurate has been debated for centuries. But the larger truth is undeniable. The world had become more connected. China was no longer an isolated civilization. It was part of a vast Eurasian network. Goods moved. Ideas moved. Diseases moved. People moved. And unfortunately, diseases are very committed travelers. The Yuan Dynasty eventually weakened. Floods, famine, tax problems, corruption, rebellion. The Red Turban movement gained strength. And among the rebels was a man from a poor background who would eventually become emperor. His name was Zhu Yuanzhang. He had been born into a peasant family. His early life was marked by poverty and hardship. He lost family members. He entered a Buddhist monastery, then left it. He joined the rebellion and slowly climbed the ranks. Eventually, he defeated his rivals. In 1368, he established the Ming Dynasty. The Mongols retreated north, and China once again had a dynasty ruled from within the traditional political world. The Ming would last nearly 3 centuries. It would build enormous walls. It would send fleets across the Indian Ocean. It would construct the Forbidden City. It would expand and contract. It would experience prosperity and famine. And eventually, it too would fall. But by now, the imperial system had become incredibly sophisticated. The emperor lived within a vast ceremonial world. The bureaucracy stretched across provinces. Officials were examined on classical texts. The civil service examination became one of the defining institutions of Chinese political life. A young man could spend years studying. His family might sacrifice financially to support him. He memorized texts, practiced essays, studied history, learned philosophy, and eventually traveled to sit for examinations that might determine his future. Success could transform a family. Failure could mean returning home to teach or manage family affairs. The system was demanding, sometimes painfully demanding, but it created something remarkable. A state bureaucracy based, at least in theory, on education and examination. Not every official was brilliant. Not every appointment was fair. Politics never disappears simply because you give people exams. But the ideal was powerful. Knowledge could lead to status. Education could lead to office. And office could lead to influence. Meanwhile, ordinary people continued their lives beneath this enormous system. A woman in a village might never see the emperor. A farmer might never meet an official above county level. A merchant might travel hundreds of miles and encounter communities with different accents and customs. Yet all belonged to the same imperial order. The Ming Emperor Yongle would take this imperial vision to remarkable heights. He moved the capital to Beijing. He built the Forbidden City. He sponsored enormous projects. And he commissioned the famous voyages of Zheng He. Imagine those fleets. Huge ships compared with many vessels of their time. Hundreds of people aboard. Sails rising over the water. Cargo. Animals. Diplomatic gifts. Maps. Instruments. The fleet traveled through Southeast Asia, across the Indian Ocean, toward India, Arabia, and the east coast of Africa. For a moment, The Ming court looked outward toward the ocean. But later rulers would become less interested in these enormous voyages. The fleets were expensive. The priorities of the state changed. The empire turned inward. The walls remained. The bureaucracy remained. The agricultural economy remained. And eventually another threat appeared. Not from the ocean. From the north. Manchu forces crossed the frontier. The Ming government was already weakened by fiscal problems, military pressures, corruption, and rebellion. Peasant uprisings spread. In 1644, Beijing fell. The last Ming emperor died, and the Manchus entered the capital. They established the Qing Dynasty. Once again, China was ruled by conquerors from beyond the traditional heartland. The Qing would become the last imperial dynasty, and, at its height, one of the largest empires on earth. Under rulers such as Kangxi, Yongzheng, and Qianlong, Qing territory expanded dramatically. The empire incorporated Mongolia, Tibet, Xinjiang, and other frontier regions through a mixture of military force, diplomacy, administration, and negotiated relationships. Population grew. Agricultural production increased. Cities expanded. The imperial court became enormously elaborate. But beneath the surface, new pressures were emerging. Europe was changing. Maritime empires were expanding. Industrialization was beginning. And the old imperial world was about to encounter a different kind of power. Power driven by factories, steam, capital, global trade, and weapons that could move across oceans. The Qing court did not immediately understand the scale of the transformation. Why would it? For centuries, China had been one of the world's great centers of wealth and civilization. There was little reason to assume that distant European states would fundamentally change the balance of power. But then came Britain, and opium, and war. The Opium Wars exposed the growing military and economic imbalance between Qing China and industrializing European powers. The treaties that followed imposed concessions. Foreign powers gained commercial privileges. Ports were opened. Territorial control was lost. And the old confidence of the imperial system began to crack. The 19th century became increasingly difficult. Internal rebellions devastated enormous areas. The Taiping Rebellion alone caused catastrophic loss of life. The Qing government struggled to respond. Foreign powers demanded concessions. Japan modernized rapidly. The Qing lost wars. The empire became increasingly vulnerable. And yet, even during these years of crisis, ordinary people continued doing ordinary things. Farmers planted rice. Women spun thread. Children played beside canals. Merchants opened their shops. Families celebrated festivals. People fell in love. People argued. People grew old. People died. This is something worth remembering. When we say that an empire is collapsing, we often imagine the collapse as something everyone can see. But most people do not live inside history books. They live inside Tuesday. They wake up. They eat. They work. They complain. They sleep. And somewhere far away, governments are collapsing. The Qing finally reached its end in 1911. Revolution spread. The emperor was still a child. The political system that had ruled China for more than 2,000 years was exhausted. The last emperor, Puyi, abdicated in 1912, and with that, imperial rule ended. But the story did not, because an empire can disappear without its civilization disappearing. The roads remain. The cities remain. The writings remain. The memories remain. The arguments remain. The old questions remain. What makes a ruler legitimate? What does a government owe its people? What happens when unity becomes more important than freedom? What happens when order becomes more valuable than justice? What happens when a civilization survives so long that its traditions become almost impossible to separate from its identity? For more than 2,000 years, China had lived through cycles of unity and division. The Qin created an empire. The Han gave it durability. The Tang made it cosmopolitan. The Song transformed its economy and culture. The Yuan connected it to the Mongol world. The Ming rebuilt and reorganized it. The Qing expanded it and then struggled to defend it against a rapidly changing world. And through all of this, countless ordinary people lived beneath the imperial sky. Their names are mostly forgotten. We remember emperors, generals, scholars, rebels, explorers. But the empire was ultimately carried by people whose names history never bothered to record. The farmer repairing an irrigation ditch. The woman preparing rice for her family. The soldier standing beside a city gate in winter. The merchant counting coins beneath a lantern. The scholar bending over a manuscript long after midnight. The child asleep beside a charcoal brazier. These people were China too. Perhaps they were China more than anyone. And tonight, as we look back across 2,000 years, it is easy to become distracted by the enormous scale of the story. Dynasties, battles, palaces, armies, canals, walls, empires. But history becomes strangely quiet when we move closer. Closer than the emperor, closer than the palace, closer than the battlefield, until all that remains is a human being sitting beside a small fire, listening to rain, waiting for morning, and perhaps wondering, as people have always wondered, whether tomorrow will be a little easier than today. That is where the story of Imperial China truly lives. Not only in the grand halls of emperors, but in the thousands of years of ordinary nights. And as the lamps burn low, the great dynasties begin to blur together. Qin, Han, 3 kingdoms. Jin, Sui, Tang, Song, Yuan, Ming, Qing. Names become echoes. Centuries become shadows. The empire itself becomes something almost dreamlike. A vast procession disappearing into mist. And somewhere beyond the last palace gate, the old roads continue into darkness. The rivers continue flowing. The mountains remain. And the night, which has outlived every emperor, settles quietly over the land. The Han world empire, silk, and the weight of heaven. The night settles slowly over the old capital. Long after the officials have gone home, long after the markets have quieted, long after the last carts have rattled through the streets, there are still lamps burning inside the imperial compound. Somewhere behind a painted screen, a court official is reading a report. Somewhere else, a servant is carrying warm water. A guard stands beneath the eaves, listening to the wind. And beyond the palace walls, Chang'an is sleeping, or at least trying to. There are thousands of people in the city, and thousands of small sounds that belong to them. A cough, a baby crying, a wooden door closing, a horse shifting its weight, a vendor packing away his baskets, a drunken argument ending badly in a narrow alley. The empire is quiet, but never completely silent. This is the world the Han Dynasty inherited after the brief and violent experiment of Qin. The Qin had discovered that an enormous territory could be conquered and administered as a single state. The Han now had to discover something much harder. How do you make people willing to live inside that state? Because conquering a kingdom is one thing. Governing its grandchildren is another. The early Han rulers understood this. They had seen what happened to Qin. Qin had moved too quickly. It had demanded too much. It had treated the population as though fear could permanently replace loyalty. And fear is useful, but fear gets expensive. Eventually, someone has to pay for all those soldiers. Someone has to feed the officials. Someone has to repair the roads. Someone has to rebuild the houses destroyed by war. Someone has to plant the fields. And if those people become too exhausted, they tend to start asking uncomfortable questions. So the Han rulers presented themselves differently. They still governed through laws. They still collected taxes. They still maintained armies. They still punished rebellion. But the tone changed. The empire began wrapping its power in a language of morality. The emperor was the son of heaven. He was supposed to preserve harmony between heaven and earth. He was supposed to protect the people. He was supposed to maintain order. The ruler was powerful, but he was not supposed to be merely powerful. He had responsibilities. This was deeply influenced by Confucian thought. Confucius himself had lived centuries earlier, during a period of political disorder. He had not imagined the modern nation-state. He had not written a constitution. He had not proposed elections. Instead, he spent much of his intellectual life asking a question that sounds deceptively simple. What makes society function? His answer involved relationships. A ruler should act like a ruler, a father like a father, a son like a son, an official like an official. A person should behave according to their obligations. It sounds conservative, and in many ways it was. But there was also something demanding hidden inside it. If a ruler expected obedience, the ruler had to behave properly. If a father demanded respect, he had responsibilities toward his family. If an official demanded taxes, he was supposed to administer fairly. The ideal society was not one in which everyone was equal. It was one in which everyone understood their role. Whether ordinary people always appreciated this philosophy is another question. But the imperial government found it extremely useful. Confucianism offered a moral language for bureaucracy, and bureaucracy was becoming the skeleton of the empire. The Han state needed people who could read documents, people who understood laws, people who could keep records, people who could calculate taxes, people who could manage grain stores, people who could inspect roads, people who could report on floods, people who could write elegant memorials explaining why the emperor should or should not do something. And so education became increasingly connected to political life. A young man from a family with enough resources might begin studying the classics. He would sit with bamboo texts or manuscripts. He would memorize passages. He would learn the correct rituals. He would learn how an ideal official should behave. His family might hope that one day he would enter government. But education was expensive, and this created a problem that would return throughout Imperial Chinese history. The empire wanted virtuous officials, but the people most able to study were often families who already possessed wealth. So the bureaucracy could never completely escape social hierarchy. Still, compared with hereditary aristocratic systems, the Chinese examination tradition eventually created an unusual path toward office. Talent mattered, but so did money. Effort mattered, but so did family connections. Merit mattered, and so, unfortunately, did knowing the right people. History is rarely impressed by purity. The early Han rulers also had to deal with the legacy of Qin's military expansion. To the north were the Xiongnu. They were not a single simple tribe in the modern sense, but a powerful confederation of peoples who could move rapidly across the steppe. For an agricultural empire, this was a serious problem. China's farmers were tied to fields. Their crops could not run away. Their cities could not pack themselves onto horses and disappear beyond the horizon. The Xiongnu could. They could raid frontier settlements. They could seize livestock. They could attack supply lines. They could retreat before a large Chinese army arrived. And this created one of the great strategic problems of the Han period. How do you fight an enemy who does not have to defend a city? The early Han rulers sometimes chose diplomacy. Sometimes they sent gifts. Sometimes they arranged marriages. Sometimes they negotiated. Sometimes they fought. The famous He arrangements involved marriages and exchanges intended to maintain peace. These agreements were sometimes presented later as humiliating. But diplomacy is often simply warfare conducted with better food. The Han court sent silk, grain, wine, and other goods. In return, it hoped the northern frontier would remain quiet. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it did not. Eventually, the Han state became more militarily aggressive. One emperor in particular transformed the empire's relationship with the steppe. Emperor Wu. He ruled from 141 to 87 BCE. His reign would become one of the defining periods of Han history. Emperor Wu was ambitious, very ambitious. He wanted to weaken the Xiongnu. He wanted to expand the empire. He wanted greater control over the frontier. And he possessed the resources to attempt it. Han armies moved westward and northward. Military colonies were established. New territories were brought under imperial influence. The empire pushed deeper into Central Asia. And this expansion opened pathways that would eventually become associated with what we now call the Silk Road. The term Silk Road can sometimes make the ancient world sound like one enormous shopping mall. Silk going west, horses coming east, spices passing through, merchants smiling, everyone exchanging goods peacefully beneath a golden sunset. The reality was considerably messier. The routes were difficult. The deserts were dangerous. Bandits existed. Political borders shifted. Caravans needed protection. Water was precious. And many merchants traveled only sections of the enormous network. Still, goods moved across extraordinary distances. Chinese silk could eventually reach Central Asia and the Mediterranean world. Horses from the western regions became valuable in China. Glassware traveled east. Metals traveled west. Ideas traveled with people. And perhaps most importantly, information traveled. The Han court became increasingly aware that beyond the familiar agricultural heartlands lay other societies. Powerful societies, strange societies, rich societies, and sometimes dangerous societies. One of the figures associated with opening China's western horizons was Zheng He. He was sent westward during Emperor Wu's reign. His mission was diplomatic, but his journey became something much larger. He encountered peoples and kingdoms unknown to the Han court. He learned about lands far beyond the empire's immediate borders. When he returned, he brought information, not just goods. Information. And information is one of the most valuable commodities an empire can possess. The Han court learned about Central Asian kingdoms. It learned about horses. It learned about routes. It learned about political possibilities. And slowly, the empire's mental map expanded. Imagine Zheng He returning to the capital, dust-covered, exhausted, perhaps thinner than when he left, standing before officials and describing distant lands, mountains, deserts, cities, horses, foreign rulers, different customs, different languages. For a court accustomed to thinking of itself as the center of civilization, this must have been fascinating, and perhaps slightly unsettling, because the world is always larger than the map on your desk. Meanwhile, life inside the empire continued. The great majority of Han subjects were farmers. This matters, because when we think about the Han Dynasty, it is tempting to imagine emperors, generals, scholars, and merchants. But most people were none of those things. Most were working the land. A peasant household might own a small plot. They planted crops. They raised animals. They produced cloth. They repaired tools. They paid taxes. They performed labor obligations. They borrowed money when harvests failed. And if they fell deeply into debt, their land could disappear. The agricultural calendar governed life. Spring meant preparation. Summer meant relentless work. Autumn meant harvest. Winter meant repair, planning, and survival. The rhythm could be comforting, but it could also be cruel. A drought could ruin a family. A flood could destroy fields. Locusts could arrive. An epidemic could spread. And when disaster came, taxes did not necessarily disappear. The empire still needed grain. The army still needed supplies. Officials still needed salaries. So the relationship between the peasant and the state was complicated. The state protected the farmer. The state also demanded from him. It was both shield and burden. And the larger the empire became, the more complicated that relationship became. In the countryside, villages were governed through local officials and community structures. People knew their neighbors. Families were connected by marriage. Ancestral traditions shaped identity. The dead remained part of the household through rituals. This was important because Confucian society placed enormous emphasis on ancestors. The past was not truly past. Your parents had given you life. Their parents had given them life. And so the family extended backward through generations. To honor ancestors was to acknowledge your place in a chain of existence. This made family both emotional and political. The empire itself often imagined the ruler as a kind of father. The household became a miniature model of government. A well-ordered family supported a well-ordered society. At least that was the theory. Real families, as you might imagine, were probably somewhat less orderly. Children disobeyed. Brothers argued. Inheritance created resentment. Marriages were negotiated. Parents worried about money. And somewhere, 2,000 years ago, a teenager was almost certainly complaining that his parents did not understand him. Some things are apparently eternal. The Han capital of Chang'an became a vast center of administration and culture. Its walls enclosed a city of enormous scale. The palace complexes were impressive. The avenues were broad. Officials moved through designated spaces. Markets sold goods from across the empire. Foreign merchants appeared. Religious practitioners gathered. Craftsmen worked. And the city's population created the noise of urban life. Think about the smell. Wood smoke. Cooked grain. Animal waste. Incense. Sweat. Fresh vegetables. Fermented foods. Leather. Dust. Human beings. Ancient cities did not smell like modern shopping districts. They smelled alive. And slightly unfortunate. At night, the city would become darker than our modern cities. No electric lights. No glowing signs. No headlights. Only lamps, torches, moonlight, and the occasional fire. Darkness was not an inconvenience. It was part of the environment. If you walked outside after midnight, you entered a different world. You could not simply illuminate an entire street. You moved carefully. You listened. You watched shadows. The night belonged to thieves, guards, animals, lovers, officials, and people who had simply been unfortunate enough to have somewhere to be. Inside the palace, darkness was controlled. Lanterns illuminated corridors. Servants moved quietly. The emperor's sleeping quarters were protected. The ruler's body was not merely a personal body. It was politically important. An emperor's illness could become a national crisis. An emperor's death could trigger a succession struggle. An emperor's dreams might be interpreted by specialists. Nothing about imperial life was entirely private. Even sleep had political consequences. And then there was the enormous world of ritual. The emperor performed ceremonies to heaven. He honored ancestors. He participated in sacrifices. He followed calendrical traditions. The imperial calendar itself mattered because time was political. The government announced the calendar. Officials used it. Farmers followed it. Festivals followed it. The emperor did not merely rule space. He was supposed to regulate time. That is an extraordinary idea. Imagine having enough political power that the date itself becomes part of your authority. And yet, the emperor's legitimacy could still be threatened by nature. A flood. A famine. An eclipse. A comet. A strange animal. A devastating storm. These events could be interpreted as signs. If heaven had approved the emperor, the realm should be harmonious. If disaster repeatedly struck, perhaps the emperor had failed. This became part of the broader concept later called the mandate of heaven. The mandate was not a permanent certificate. It could be lost. A dynasty might begin with heaven's approval and end after becoming corrupt. This idea provided a philosophical explanation for rebellion. A successful rebel who replaced a dynasty could later claim that heaven had withdrawn its mandate from the old rulers. This is convenient, of course. It means the winner can explain why the winner was destined to win. History has many such conveniences. Still, the concept mattered. It gave political change a moral framework. The emperor was not supposed to be immortal. The dynasty was not supposed to last forever. And the Chinese historical tradition became deeply interested in cycles. Rise, prosperity, decline, collapse, rebellion, reunification. The pattern would appear again and again, sometimes with uncanny similarity, sometimes with completely different causes. But the pattern became part of how later generations understood the past. The Han itself eventually entered a period of internal tension. Power increasingly concentrated among imperial relatives and court factions. Empresses could become politically powerful. Their families could gain influence. Eunuchs within the palace could become important. This last group is often misunderstood. Eunuchs were men who had been castrated, often because they were employed within the imperial household where access to the ruler was tightly controlled. Because they could live and work close to the emperor and inner court, some eunuchs gained extraordinary political power. This created resentment. Officials outside the palace saw them as corrupt intruders. Eunuchs saw many officials as threats. The result was a long political struggle. Court politics became a maze. And when politics becomes a maze, someone eventually gets lost. The Han court became increasingly divided. Meanwhile, powerful families were accumulating land. Small farmers struggled. Local elites gained influence. The central government had difficulty controlling distant regions. Then nature intervened. Floods, famine, disease. All could intensify political instability. And when ordinary people become desperate enough, religious movements can become powerful. One such movement was associated with the Yellow Turbans. In 184 CE, rebellion erupted across large parts of the empire. The rebels believed that the existing order was corrupt and doomed. Their movement combined religious belief with social dissatisfaction. The government eventually suppressed the rebellion, but the damage had been done. To put down the revolt, the Han court had relied heavily on regional military commanders. And these commanders discovered something dangerous. They had armies. Their armies obeyed them. And once a general has thousands of armed men who answer to him rather than directly to the emperor, the political landscape becomes slightly complicated. Power began shifting outward. Regional warlords emerged. The central government weakened. The empire entered a long period of fragmentation. The Three Kingdoms era followed. If you know the famous stories, you may picture brilliant generals, dramatic duels, clever strategists, elaborate schemes, and heroic speeches beneath banners waving in the wind. Those stories became enormously popular. But underneath the legend was something much darker. War is mostly logistics, food, horses, weapons, disease, roads, weather, and exhausted men. A brilliant strategy means very little if the army has no grain. A heroic speech does not feed soldiers. A beautiful banner does not stop an arrow. The ordinary experience of war was often waiting. Waiting for orders. Waiting for supplies. Waiting for the enemy. Waiting for winter. Waiting for the siege to end. And waiting to discover whether the person standing beside you would still be alive tomorrow. The Three Kingdoms eventually became part of China's literary imagination. But the political fragmentation lasted. The Qin briefly reunified the country. Then northern invasions and internal struggles shattered that unity. Northern China became divided among competing states. Southern China developed its own political centers. Aristocratic families became powerful. Buddhism spread more deeply, and the empire became culturally diverse. This is an important point. China was never culturally frozen. It changed constantly. People moved. Languages mixed. Religions spread. Foreign customs were adopted. New foods arrived. New artistic styles appeared. New technologies developed. Even the concept of what it meant to be Chinese evolved. The old idea of a single unchanging civilization is misleading. What survived was not sameness. It was continuity through adaptation. This would become especially visible with Buddhism. Buddhism had originated in South Asia and traveled along networks of trade and pilgrimage. By the early centuries of the Common Era, Buddhist monks were arriving in China. They brought scriptures, images, rituals, philosophical ideas, new ways of thinking about suffering, desire, death, and liberation. For some Chinese thinkers, Buddhism offered answers that traditional philosophies did not. Life is suffering. Attachment causes suffering. The self is not as permanent as it seems. Meditation can transform consciousness. Rebirth is possible. Liberation is possible. These ideas entered a society already deeply concerned with ancestors, family, duty, and social order. The resulting interaction was fascinating. Chinese Buddhism was not simply imported unchanged. It adapted. It absorbed local traditions. It developed new schools. It influenced art. It influenced literature. It influenced politics. And eventually it became one of the great intellectual forces of Chinese history. But Buddhism also raised uncomfortable questions for Confucian thinkers. If a monk leaves his family to seek enlightenment, is he fulfilling his duty as a son? If the goal is to escape worldly attachment, what happens to political responsibility? If the body is temporary, why preserve ancestral rituals? These were not minor philosophical disagreements. They touched the foundations of society. And yet, as often happens in history, people found ways to combine traditions. Confucianism, Taoism, Buddhism. They did not always agree, but ordinary people could draw from all three. A person might participate in ancestral rituals, visit a Buddhist temple, consult a Taoist practitioner, and then go home and worry about taxes. Human beings are wonderfully capable of carrying several contradictory ideas at once. The centuries of division eventually produced new forms of political organization. Northern and southern traditions interacted. Military rulers rose. Aristocratic families declined. And slowly, the possibility of reunification returned. The Sui emerged. Yang Jian, the founder of the Sui dynasty, had a difficult task. The north had been divided. The south had its own government. Cultural differences existed. Political elites had competing interests. Yet in 589, the Sui completed the reunification of China. Once again, there was an emperor. Once again, there was a centralized state. Once again, officials began receiving orders from a single court. And once again, the government began building. The Sui emperors repaired old canals. They constructed new roads. They expanded the Grand Canal. They strengthened the capital. They reorganized administration. The canal became especially important. It connected the wealthy agricultural regions of the south with the political centers of the north. Grain could move. Troops could move. Officials could move. Information could move. The empire could breathe. But someone had to build the canal. Workers. Millions of them over time. Imagine the labor. Mud beneath bare feet. Mosquitoes. Heat. Cold. Blisters. Back pain. Long days. Short meals. Orders from supervisors. And the knowledge that refusing could bring punishment. For the emperor, the canal was infrastructure. For the laborer, it was a trench filled with water and exhaustion. Both descriptions were true. That is one of the difficulties of history. The same project can be both a magnificent achievement and a human tragedy. The Sui also made another mistake. They attacked Korea. Again. And again. And again. The campaigns failed. The costs were enormous. The state demanded more soldiers, more grain, more transport, more labor. And the population began to resist. Rebellion spread. The Sui dynasty collapsed. It had reunited China in 589. By 618, it was gone. And once again, the lesson seemed obvious. A dynasty could be powerful enough to unite China and still be destroyed by the burden of governing it. Out of the chaos emerged a new ruling house, the Tang. The Tang Dynasty would become one of the most famous periods in Chinese history. And when we finally reach Chang'an again, the city will be larger, louder, more international, and more dazzling than anything the Han emperors had known. The Tang world would stretch far beyond the old heartlands. Foreign merchants would crowd the markets. Monks would travel across deserts. Poets would turn moonlight into immortal verses. Generals would command armies on distant frontiers. And emperors would sit behind screens, believing that the machinery of the world still moved according to their will. For a time, it almost seemed true. But beneath the beauty, the old questions remained. How much can an empire demand? How much can a people endure? How much power should one ruler possess? And how long can prosperity survive before prosperity itself becomes a source of weakness? The Tang would eventually answer those questions. Not gently. But before the storms arrived, there would be a golden age. And somewhere in the darkness before dawn, a new city was beginning to wake. Chang'an, the greatest capital of the Tang world. Its gates would soon open. Merchants would begin their work. Horses would stamp against the stone. Officials would hurry toward the palace. Incense would rise. And the empire would begin another day. Another ordinary day. Another day inside a civilization that had already survived centuries of war, famine, ambition, rebellion, and death. The sun would rise over the rooftops, and for a little while longer everything would appear stable, which, in imperial history, was usually the moment when you should start becoming suspicious. The Tang Dynasty, the golden age and the storm beneath it. Dawn comes slowly to Chang'an. The eastern sky turns pale behind the walls of the great capital, and for a few moments the city exists between darkness and daylight. The tiled roofs are still gray. The streets are damp with the night's coolness. A thin mist hangs close to the ground. Then, somewhere near the gates, a bell sounds. One note. Then another. The city begins to stir. A stable boy leads horses into the street. A servant opens a wooden door. A merchant lifts the shutters of his shop. A cook begins preparing rice. A Buddhist monk walks quietly toward a temple. An official adjusts his robes and prepares to leave for the palace. And in the distance, beyond the city walls, farmers are already beginning another day of work. It is the 7th century. The Sui dynasty has disappeared. The civil wars have ended. And the Tang Dynasty has taken its place. The new rulers have inherited a reunited China. But they have also inherited the lessons of the Sui. Do not demand too much. Do not fight too many wars. Do not assume that because an emperor can command 1 million people, those people will happily continue obeying forever. The early Tang rulers understood this. The founder of the dynasty, Li Yuan, established himself as emperor in 618. But one of the most important figures in the dynasty's early history was his son, Li Shimin. He would become Emperor Taizong, and Taizong would become one of the most admired rulers in Chinese history. His reign became associated with political stability, military strength, administrative competence, and a willingness to listen to capable advisors. This last quality was particularly important. An emperor who believes he is always correct is a dangerous creature. An emperor who knows he might be wrong is still dangerous, of course. But at least there is hope. Taizong surrounded himself with advisors who were willing to criticize him. One of them was Wei Zheng. The relationship between ruler and advisor became almost legendary. Wei Zheng could be blunt, sometimes extremely blunt, and Taizong tolerated it because he understood something that many rulers eventually forget. If ever you are ruling a fantasy, the early Tang government attempted to create a balanced administrative system. The empire was divided into provinces and prefectures. Officials were appointed. Tax systems were organized. Land policies were developed. Military obligations were structured. The court maintained detailed records. The machinery of government became sophisticated. And beneath it all was a simple necessity: food. An empire can survive ideological disagreement, can survive a bad poem, it can survive an ugly palace. But if the grain warehouses are empty, everyone becomes interested very quickly. The Tang state depended heavily on agricultural production. Land taxes and labor obligations supported the government. The equal field system attempted to distribute land according to household needs and maintain a stable agricultural tax base. In theory, the system was orderly. In practice, land accumulation and demographic change gradually weakened it. Still, during the early Tang, the system functioned well enough to support prosperity. And prosperity changed the character of the empire. The Tang capital of Chang'an became enormous. Imagine entering the city. You pass through a monumental gate. Beyond it stretches a grid of broad streets. Residential wards are enclosed by walls. Markets occupy designated areas. Temples rise above rooftops. Government offices occupy enormous compounds. The palace lies toward the north, elevated above the city. And everywhere there are people. Farmers who have come to sell produce. Merchants carrying goods. Officials from distant provinces. Soldiers. Monks. Foreign visitors. Musicians. Craftsmen. Servants. Students. Begging children. Wealthy aristocrats. Poor laborers. Chang'an was not merely a Chinese city. It was an international city. People arrived from Central Asia, from Korea, from Japan, from the Korean kingdoms, from Persia and lands farther west. Sogdian merchants became particularly important in long-distance trade. They moved goods across Central Asia and established communities along the routes. The streets of Chang'an therefore contained languages that would have sounded foreign to a local farmer. You might hear Chinese, then a Central Asian tongue, then perhaps Persian, then Korean, then someone arguing over the price of vegetables in a dialect from hundreds of miles away. This cosmopolitan atmosphere was one of the defining features of the Tang. The empire was connected to the wider Eurasian world. Silk traveled west. Horses traveled east. Glassware. Spices. Metal, precious stones. Religious texts. Stories. Music. Clothing styles. Ideas. The empire absorbed foreign influences while simultaneously transforming them. This is one of the great misunderstandings about ancient civilizations. Cultures do not develop in sealed rooms. They borrow. They adapt. They imitate. They reject. They combine. A new musical instrument appears. A new style of painting becomes fashionable. A foreign food enters the markets. A new religious idea gains followers. Someone says it is foreign and therefore suspicious. Someone else says it is fascinating. And 20 years later, everyone's grandchildren assume it has always been there. That was Tang China, a civilization comfortable enough, at least for a time, to absorb the outside world. Religion played an enormous role. Buddhism was flourishing. Monasteries possessed land. Monks traveled. Pilgrims journeyed across enormous distances. And one of the most famous travelers was Xuanzang. He left China in the 7th century to travel to India, seeking Buddhist scriptures and teachings. The journey was extraordinary. Deserts, mountains, political borders, bandits, extreme weather, long stretches without water. And yet Xuanzang continued. He eventually reached India, studied at major Buddhist centers, and returned to China carrying texts. His journey later became legendary, but the actual journey must have been exhausting beyond imagination. Imagine crossing a desert on foot or horseback. The horizon looks the same in every direction. The air is dry. Your water supply is carefully measured. The animals are tired. The sun burns during the day. At night, the temperature drops. There is no hospital, no emergency service, no convenient road, no message waiting for you at the next town saying, "Don't worry, we have your reservation." There is only the road and the decision to continue. Xuanzang's travels demonstrated how deeply connected the Tang world was to the wider Buddhist world. When he returned to Chang'an, he became an important intellectual figure. The emperor supported his translation work. Texts were copied. Monks studied. Ideas spread. Buddhist art flourished. Caves were decorated. Statues were carved. And across China, people encountered new visions of the universe. Yet Buddhism was not alone. Taoism remained deeply influential. Confucian traditions continued shaping government. The three traditions existed in tension and cooperation. A scholar might study Confucian classics. A family might maintain ancestral rites. A monk might meditate in the mountains. A Taoist priest might perform rituals. And an ordinary household might borrow practices from all of them. The boundaries between traditions were often more flexible in daily life than later textbooks suggest. Meanwhile, the imperial court developed its own culture of elegance. Poetry became central to elite life, and the Tang produced some of China's most celebrated poets. Du Fu, Li Bai, Wang Wei. Their poems often described nature, friendship, exile, war, wine, moonlight, grief, and the passing of time, which is rather fitting for a civilization that was itself constantly changing. Li Bai, in particular, became famous for his association with wine and moonlight. It is tempting to imagine him sitting beside a river under a perfect moon, drinking elegantly and composing immortal poetry. Perhaps sometimes he did. But poets, like everyone else, also had bad days. They got sick. They argued. They worried about money. They missed home. They made mistakes. The romantic image is only half the story. And because the moon really does look different when you are far from home. The Tang military campaigns pushed into Central Asia. Korea became a major strategic concern. The empire fought with the Korean kingdom of Goguryeo. The Tang eventually allied with Silla and helped defeat Goguryeo. But military expansion was expensive. Again, the empire faced the same old problem. Victory requires resources. Resources require taxation. Taxation creates pressure. Pressure creates resentment. The early Tang rulers were careful. But as decades passed, the balance began to shift. The aristocracy accumulated influence. Landholding patterns changed. The equal field system weakened. The state had increasing difficulty maintaining its tax base. And then came one of the most extraordinary figures in Chinese history, Wu Zhao. She would eventually become Wu Zetian. Her story begins quietly. She was born into a relatively wealthy family and entered the imperial court as a concubine of Emperor Taizong. After Taizong's death, she was sent to a Buddhist convent according to the customs surrounding imperial concubines. And that might have been the end of her political career. Except it wasn't. She returned to court under the new emperor, Gaozong. She became a favored concubine, then empress. The path from concubine to empress was dangerous. Court politics were ruthless. Rival women at court had enormous stakes in imperial succession. The emperor's mother and relatives could influence decisions. Officials could support different factions. And rumors could become weapons. Wu Zhao survived. More than survived. She gained power. She learned how the court worked. She understood that the emperor could be influenced through proximity. She cultivated alliances. She promoted loyal officials. She weakened rivals. And eventually, when Emperor Gaozong became ill, she increasingly took part in government. Behind the throne, she became a ruler. After Gaozong's death, she controlled the court through her sons. Then, in 690, she took the final step. She declared herself emperor. Not empress dowager. Not regent. Emperor. The only woman in Chinese history to rule as sovereign under her own dynasty. She established the Zhou dynasty between periods of Tang rule. For traditional historians, this was almost unbearable. A woman had taken the throne, and not only had she taken it, she had governed. Wu Zetian understood the symbolic power of religion. Buddhist texts and prophecies could be interpreted to support her legitimacy. She commissioned monuments. She promoted officials who were not entirely dependent on the old aristocracy. She used the examination system to bring talented men into government. She also used surveillance, informants, punishments, political repression. Her reign was neither simply benevolent nor simply monstrous. It was complicated. Like most successful political careers, she could be ruthless. She could also be an effective administrator. Her government maintained order. Agricultural production continued. The bureaucracy expanded. The state remained powerful. And she demonstrated that the imperial system could be manipulated by someone who did not fit its traditional expectations. Imagine the atmosphere inside the palace. A woman seated where emperors had sat for generations. Officials kneeling before her. Ceremonial music. Incense. Silk banners. And outside, people trying to understand what was happening. Some probably admired her. Some feared her. Some despised her. Most probably had other things to worry about. If you were a farmer in a distant village, the fact that the emperor was now an empress might have been interesting. But the harvest still needed to be brought in. The roof still leaked. The children still needed food. The tax collector would still arrive. History is full of enormous events that ordinary people experience only indirectly. Wu Zetian eventually died in 705. The Tang Dynasty was restored, and decades later came the reign of Emperor Xuanzong. Under Xuanzong, the Tang reached extraordinary cultural heights. The capital flourished. The economy was strong. Poetry thrived. Trade expanded. The imperial court became famous for music and luxury. And yet, beneath the surface, the military structure of the empire was changing. Frontier commanders were becoming increasingly powerful. These men commanded large armies far from the capital. They were supposed to protect the empire. But an army loyal primarily to its general is always a potential problem. One of the most powerful frontier commanders was in Lushan. He was a fascinating figure. He came from a frontier background with mixed cultural heritage. He gained favor at court. He became close to the emperor. He was also enormous. Ancient accounts describe him as extremely large and charismatic. He was able to entertain the court. He cultivated relationships with powerful people. The emperor's favorite consort, Yang Guifei, and her family became deeply involved in court politics. The story has often been romanticized. Emperor Xuanzong was aging. He became increasingly absorbed in pleasure and court life. The empire seemed stable, but stability can hide cracks. In 755, and Lushan rebelled. His rebellion began in the northeast and rapidly expanded. The government struggled to respond. The imperial court panicked. The rebellion moved toward the capital, and the emperor fled. Imagine Chang'an during those days, a city that had seemed so confident, now filled with rumors, officials running, families packing what they could carry, merchants closing shops, soldiers moving through streets, people looking toward the roads, waiting for news, waiting for an army, waiting for someone to say that the rebellion had been defeated. But the news was not reassuring. The imperial family fled westward. At Maui, the army became furious. The soldiers blamed the Yang family. Yang Guifei, the emperor's beloved consort, was forced to die. It was a horrifying moment. The emperor's private grief collided with the political survival of the dynasty. And then the march continued. The rebellion would last for years. Cities changed hands. Armies fought. Food supplies collapsed. Disease spread. The empire's administrative structure was damaged. The demographic consequences were catastrophic. Precise population figures from the period are difficult to interpret because records themselves were disrupted. but the scale of death and displacement was enormous. And this is where the glamorous image of the Tang begins to fracture. The poetry remains. The paintings remain. The magnificent statues remain. But beneath them was a society that could be devastated by war. The rebellion was eventually suppressed. The Tang Dynasty survived, but it emerged weakened. Regional military governors, known as Jidushi, had gained greater independence. The central government struggled to control them. Tax revenues declined. Landholding patterns changed. The old political balance was gone. And yet the Tang cultural influence remained enormous. Even after political power weakened, Chang'an and other Tang cities continued to shape East Asia. Japan sent envoys. Korea interacted with Tang institutions. Chinese writing and political models influenced neighboring societies. Tang culture traveled. The dynasty had become more than a government. It had become a cultural reference point. But imperial decline continued. There were rebellions, court struggles, economic problems, and finally, in 907, the Tang Dynasty ended. The empire fragmented. The 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms period followed. Once again, China divided. Once again, rulers claimed legitimacy. Once again, armies marched. Once again, people living in villages had to survive whichever army happened to pass by. The political map became complicated. Northern regimes rose and fell. Southern kingdoms developed their own cultures and economies. The South continued to grow in importance. This would matter enormously, because the future of China was slowly shifting. For centuries, the northern plains had been the political heart of the empire. But the South was becoming economically indispensable. The Yangtze Basin was extraordinarily productive. Rice cultivation expanded. Canals connected regions. Cities grew. Commercial networks became stronger. And eventually, a new dynasty would unify the country, the Song. In 960, Zhao Guangyin became emperor. He would be known as Emperor Taizu of Song. The Song rulers learned from the violence of the preceding centuries. They were cautious about military commanders. They strengthened civilian administration. They placed greater emphasis on bureaucracy. The scholar official became increasingly central to political life. The ideal official was not simply a warrior. He was educated. He understood classical texts. He could write. He knew ritual. He could administer. This created a different kind of state. A state in which the educated elite became deeply connected to government. And education became a path toward status. The examination system expanded. A young man might spend years studying. He might memorize thousands of characters. He might practice composing essays. He might sit for examinations repeatedly. Some candidates failed again and again. Imagine the pressure. Your family has spent money educating you. Your neighbors know you are preparing. Your father expects success. Your mother has perhaps sewn your clothes and prepared food while you studied. You enter the examination hall. The room is divided into tiny cells. You sit alone. You receive the questions. And now you have to prove that you understand the classics well enough to deserve a place in the bureaucracy. You cannot simply say, "I have a good feeling about this." The examiner would probably not be impressed. The successful candidate gains prestige. His family gains prestige. His children gain opportunities. His descendants may become officials. Education becomes a family investment. And over generations, scholar-official families emerge. The Song world therefore becomes increasingly literate. Books become more available. Printing expands. Woodblock printing allows texts to be reproduced more efficiently. Later, movable type develops. Knowledge can travel faster. And once knowledge becomes easier to reproduce, society begins to change. Books are not only for philosophers. They can contain agricultural manuals, medical information, calendars, maps, stories, religious texts, practical instructions. The written word begins entering more corners of society. And then another technology appears: gunpowder. At first, it is not the terrifying weapon later centuries will know. Early formulas are used in fireworks, incendiary weapons, and other military applications. But the principle is there. A mixture of ingredients can produce explosive force. Human beings, having discovered this, naturally begin asking what else it might do. Because of course they did. The Song period would become famous for technological innovation. But it was also a period of extraordinary economic transformation. Markets expanded. Merchants became more influential. Cities became larger. Money circulated. Paper currency was used on a significant scale. Maritime trade expanded. Ships became sophisticated. The compass became increasingly useful for navigation. And the southern economy became central to the empire. Imagine a busy Song-era market. You hear vendors shouting. You smell tea, fish, rice, spices, fermented foods, smoke. The air is crowded with voices. A merchant checks his accounts. Porter carries sacks. A scholar walks past. A woman negotiates over cloth. Children run between adults. A storyteller gathers a crowd. A Buddhist monk asks for alms. A government official passes by. The city is alive. And compared with earlier imperial periods, it is increasingly commercial. People are not simply producing for their own households. They are buying, selling, investing, traveling, borrowing, speculating. The economy is becoming more complex. But the Song faces a problem. Its neighbors are powerful. To the north, the Khitan-led Liao state controls important territories. Then another state rises, the Jin. The Song negotiates, pays tribute, fights, negotiates again. The dynasty is wealthy, but wealth does not automatically produce military security. In fact, sometimes wealth makes a society more attractive to its enemies. The Song eventually loses northern territories. The court moves south. The dynasty becomes divided into what historians call the Northern Song and Southern Song periods. The capital shifts to Hangzhou, and Hangzhou becomes one of the most spectacular cities of the medieval world. A city of canals, gardens, markets, boats, tea houses, temples, workshops, merchants, scholars, an enormous wealth. The southern economy becomes the engine of the empire, but the political horizon darkens. Far to the north, something is changing. The Mongols are beginning to unite, and when the Mongol armies come, they will bring a new kind of warfare. They will move rapidly. They will adapt. They will use siege technology. They will recruit engineers from conquered peoples. They will absorb knowledge. They will not simply attack China. They will gradually dismantle the political world that has existed for centuries. The first Mongol leader to create the Great Expansion is Temujin. We know him as Genghis Khan. His childhood was difficult. His father was killed. His family struggled. He survived. He built alliances. He defeated rivals. He united Mongol tribes. And then he turned outward. His armies conquered across Central Asia. Cities fell. States disappeared. The Mongol Empire expanded with astonishing speed. After Genghis Khan's death, his successors continued the expansion. One branch of the Mongol imperial family focused on China. Kublai Khan became the dominant Mongol ruler in East Asia. He understood that ruling China required more than horseback warfare. He needed bureaucracy. He needed taxes. He needed cities. He needed grain. He needed administrators. He needed legitimacy. So he adopted Chinese imperial traditions while retaining Mongol identity. In 1271, he proclaimed the Yuan Dynasty. The Song still controlled southern China. The war continued for years. And if you imagine the final decades of the Song as a heroic last stand, Remember that most people living through them were not heroes. They were frightened. They were hungry. They were trying to escape armies. They watched cities fall. They watched political orders collapse. Some fought. Some surrendered. Some fled. Some simply waited. In 1279, the last major Song resistance was defeated. The Yuan now ruled all of China. The Mongol conquest was complete. The old world had ended. A foreign dynasty sat on the throne. Yet once again, China adapted. The Mongols would rule. They would build. They would tax. They would fight. They would trade. They would connect China more directly with the wider Mongol world. And for a while, the empire would become part of a transcontinental system stretching from East Asia to Eastern Europe. Merchants could travel farther than before. Diplomats moved. Missionaries arrived. Foreign travelers appeared. The world seemed strangely connected. But beneath the surface were tensions. Mongol elites occupied privileged positions. Different groups were treated differently under the Yuan system. Taxes were heavy. Floods damaged agricultural regions. Famine spread. The government struggled. And eventually rebellion began. Among the rebels would be a man who had known poverty firsthand. A former monk. A former beggar. A soldier. Commander. A survivor. His name was Zhu Yuanzhang. He would defeat the Yuan, and he would build the Ming Dynasty. But that story belongs to another night in this long imperial journey. For now, the Mongol Yuan world settles into darkness. A foreign court sits in Beijing. The old Song dynasty is gone. The cities of the south are recovering. The canals are still flowing. Merchants are still moving. Farmers are still planting. Children are still being born. And somewhere beneath the moonlight, an exhausted traveler looks north and wonders what kind of empire will come next. The answer is already approaching. A man who once had almost nothing will soon wear the robes of an emperor. He will build walls. He will build palaces. He will send fleets across the ocean. He will try to make the empire orderly. And, like every ruler before him, he will discover that ruling China is much harder than conquering it. The night deepens. The Tang poets are gone. The Song scholars are gone. The Mongol horsemen are riding into history. Their footsteps fade. And beneath the silence, the next dynasty is waiting. The Ming Dynasty, the empire behind the walls. Night has fallen over the north. The wind moves across the dry fields beyond the old Mongol capital, carrying dust along the roads. In the distance, a watchtower stands against the darkening sky. A few lamps burn inside. A soldier sits near a small fire. His armor is laid beside him. His boots are covered in dust. He has been awake for most of the day. Perhaps he is thinking about home. Perhaps he is thinking about food. Perhaps he is thinking about nothing at all. And far to the south, in villages scattered across the countryside, farmers are preparing for another uncertain season. The Yuan dynasty is weakening. Floods have damaged fields. The Yellow River has changed its course in places. Taxes are heavy. The government struggles to control distant provinces. And people have begun to speak of the end. In Imperial China, the language of rebellion was rarely simply political. People did not necessarily say, "We disagree with this administrative structure." They might say something much more dangerous. Heaven has withdrawn its favor. The old dynasty has lost the mandate. A new order must come. And among the many men who will rise during this period is one who seems particularly unlikely to become emperor. Zhu Yuanzhang. He had been born into poverty. His family lived as tenant farmers. His childhood was marked by hardship. Then disaster came. Famine. Disease. Death. Members of his family died. There was little security, little certainty. And eventually, Zhu entered a Buddhist monastery. He became a monk. For a while, he lived there. Then the monastery itself was unable to support its members. Zhu left. He wandered. He begged. He traveled. And somewhere along this difficult road, he entered the world of rebellion. He joined the Red Turban movement. At first, he was simply one man among many. But Zhu was observant. He understood organization. He understood discipline. He understood that a rebellion could not survive on anger alone. It needed grain. It needed soldiers. It needed money. It needed administrators. It needed legitimacy. And perhaps most importantly, it needed a story. Zhu gradually became a powerful military leader. He defeated rivals. He gained territory. He attracted educated advisors. And unlike some rebel leaders, he understood the importance of appealing to the scholar official class. He could not simply say, "I have an army." He needed to say, "I am restoring proper government." That distinction mattered, because China had a long political memory. People did not necessarily want a new world. They often wanted the old world repaired. A ruler who could claim to restore order had an enormous advantage. By the 1360s, Zhu's power had grown enormously. The Yuan rulers were increasingly unable to control China. In 1368, Zhu declared himself emperor. He established the Ming Dynasty. He chose the reign title Hanggu. And now the former beggar was emperor. The transformation is almost too dramatic. A boy who had known hunger, a young man who had wandered the roads, former monk, a rebel commander, now seated on the dragon throne. But perhaps poverty had taught Zhu something that palace life could not. He knew how fragile survival was. He knew what famine meant. He knew how quickly a family could disappear. And he was determined to build a state strong enough to prevent chaos. The problem was that Zhu's idea of strength was not gentle. He became deeply suspicious of officials. He feared corruption. He feared conspiracies. He feared rebellion. He feared anyone who might become powerful enough to challenge the throne. And so the Hanggu emperor built an extremely centralized government. He reduced the power of the traditional chief ministers. He reorganized the bureaucracy. He tightened control over officials. He imposed harsh punishments. He demanded loyalty. The emperor personally reviewed enormous numbers of documents. He worked relentlessly. And when he discovered corruption, his punishments could be severe. There is something almost exhausting about imagining his daily routine. Morning begins. Reports arrive. Officials kneel. Documents are read. Petitions are reviewed. Orders are written. Punishments are approved. Taxes are discussed. Military matters are considered. Then more reports. And more. The emperor's workload became enormous. He had destroyed one of the central positions that traditionally helped coordinate government. Now he had to fill the gap himself. Perhaps he believed that if something was worth doing, it was worth personally checking. Which sounds admirable until you realize how many documents an empire can produce. And China produced many. The Ming state became a vast bureaucratic machine. The emperor stood at the top. Below him were ministries, provincial governments, prefectures, counties, and local officials. The system reached into village life. Households were registered. Taxes were assessed. Labor obligations were organized. Military households were maintained. The empire wanted to know who lived where, who owned land, who owed taxes, who served in the military, who was related to whom. The state wanted legibility. A farmer might experience this as a household register. A soldier might experience it as hereditary military service. A merchant might experience it as regulation. An official might experience it as paperwork. And an emperor might experience it as control. But even the strongest government has limits. China was enormous. Messages took time. Officials were human. Corruption returned. Local elites found ways around regulations. The empire could command, but it could not always see. And when a government cannot see everything, people become creative. They hide grain. They alter records. They negotiate. They bribe. They exploit loopholes. They survive. The Ming rulers also inherited a major problem: the northern frontier. The Mongols had been pushed away from the traditional Chinese heartland. But they had not disappeared. They remained beyond the frontier. The Ming therefore invested heavily in defense. Walls were repaired. Walls were expanded. Garrisons were established. Fortifications were constructed. Eventually, the Great Wall system became one of the defining symbols of Ming China. But the wall was not one single continuous structure built at one moment. It was a collection of walls, fortifications, trenches, towers, and defensive works built and rebuilt across centuries. Still, under the Ming, enormous sections were constructed in brick and stone. Imagine the workers, thousands of them, climbing steep mountains, carrying bricks, mixing mortar, cutting stone, building towers where no ordinary person would voluntarily choose to build anything. The view from the top might be spectacular. The work was probably less so. The wall stretches across ridges. Watchtowers rise above valleys. Signal fires can be lit. Messages travel through smoke and flame. The empire is trying to create a barrier between agricultural China and the peoples of the steppe. But walls are never perfect. People climb them. People go around them. People negotiate through them. People attack them. People abandon them. Still, the wall becomes a powerful symbol. It says something about the Ming state. We are here. This is our land. Beyond this lies danger. Inside this lies order. Or at least that is the idea. The Ming also rebuilt Beijing. And eventually Beijing became the imperial capital. At its heart rose the Forbidden City. Imagine approaching it for the first time. Massive gates. Red walls. Golden roofs. Stone terraces. Ceremonial courtyards. The architecture is designed to communicate hierarchy. The emperor is not merely a wealthy man living in a large house. He is the center of the political universe. Every courtyard, every gate, every staircase, every color, every direction, every ritual reinforces that idea. The Forbidden City is not simply a palace. It is political theater made of stone, wood, tile, and space. The farther you move inward, the more restricted the access becomes. Ordinary people never enter. Even officials do not simply wander in. Access is controlled. The emperor lives at the center. But ironically, the more isolated the emperor becomes, the more difficult it can be to know what is actually happening beyond the palace. This would become a recurring problem. Information. Who tells the emperor the truth? Who decides which reports reach him? Who edits them? Who exaggerates? Who hides bad news? The palace is full of people who want something. Officials. Relatives. Eunuchs. Generals. Scholars. Women of the inner court. Everyone has interests, and the emperor sits at the center of this web. One group would become especially powerful. Eunuchs. Like earlier dynasties, the Ming court employed eunuchs in large numbers. Some served ordinary household functions. Others worked in administration. Some commanded military units. Some became extremely influential. The famous Zheng He was a eunuch, and his story would take the Ming beyond the Great Wall. It would take the empire to the sea. Zheng He was born in Yunnan to a Muslim family. As a young boy, he was captured during a Ming campaign and brought into imperial service. He was castrated and became part of the imperial household. Over time, he rose in rank. Eventually, he became the commander of enormous maritime expeditions. These voyages were ordered by the Yongle Emperor, and they were spectacular. The first expedition departed in 1405. Hundreds of ships participated across the major voyages. Thousands of men traveled. The fleet moved through Southeast Asia, across the Indian Ocean, to India, toward Arabia, and to the eastern coast of Africa. Imagine seeing one of these fleets arrive. You are standing in a harbor somewhere along the Indian Ocean. The horizon is blue. The air is hot. The smell of salt and spices fills the harbor. Fishing boats move nearby. Then enormous sails appear. One ship. Then another. Then another. The fleet grows across the horizon. Drums sound. Flags rise. Foreign sailors watch. Local rulers send representatives. The ships carry porcelain, silk, metal goods, officials, soldiers, animals, diplomatic gifts. And the message is clear. The Ming Emperor is powerful. The voyages were not simply commercial expeditions. They were diplomatic displays. They projected imperial prestige. Foreign rulers were expected to acknowledge the Ming court's position within a hierarchical international order. This was the tributary system. In the Ming worldview, foreign rulers could send missions to China bearing tribute. In return, they received gifts, trade opportunities, titles, and recognition. The system was not simply a one-way extraction of wealth. China often gave more in gifts than it received. The point was political. The emperor occupied the center. The outside world interacted with that center. It was an ideological model of international relations. But there was a practical side too. Trade, information, prestige, security. The voyages continued under Yongle and his successors. But eventually they stopped. Why? There was no single reason. The voyages were expensive. The political priorities of the court changed. Northern defense remained important. Officials questioned the usefulness of the expeditions. The bureaucracy became less enthusiastic about the maritime projects. And gradually, the great fleets disappeared. Ships were no longer sent across the Indian Ocean on the same scale. Some records were neglected. Some ships decayed. The empire turned inward. This is often presented as a mysterious moment when China simply closed itself. The reality was more complicated. China continued to trade. Chinese merchants continued to travel. Maritime commerce continued. The state itself simply became less interested in sponsoring enormous prestige voyages. The ocean did not disappear. The ships did not disappear. The empire's priorities changed. And this distinction matters, because history is rarely a switch that goes from on to off. It is usually a long dimming. The Ming economy remained powerful. Agriculture expanded. New crops eventually arrived from the Americas through global trade networks. Maize, sweet potatoes, peanuts. These crops could grow in environments where traditional grains were less productive. Over time, they helped support population growth. Silver also became increasingly important. Global trade brought American silver into Asian markets, much of it indirectly through Spanish-controlled territories. Chinese merchants and tax systems increasingly relied on silver. This connected Ming China to the emerging global economy. So while the court sometimes looked inward, the Chinese economy was becoming deeply connected to the world. A merchant might never see a European ship, but silver from mines thousands of miles away could still affect the price of his goods. This is one of the quiet revolutions of the early modern world. Globalization did not begin with the internet. It began with ships, coins, crops, diseases, and people. The Ming population grew dramatically. More people meant more agricultural production, more cities, more markets, more taxes. But it also meant greater vulnerability. If harvests failed, millions could be affected. And in the 17th century, the climate became less predictable. The period often called the Little Ice Age brought cooler conditions across parts of the Northern Hemisphere. In China, droughts and floods became serious problems in some regions. Harvest failures increased. Food prices rose. People became desperate. And when a government is already struggling financially, famine is dangerous. The Ming state faced growing fiscal pressures. Military defense was expensive. The northern frontier demanded money. The treasury struggled. Silver supplies fluctuated. Tax collection became harder, and local populations were increasingly burdened. Then came rebellion. One of the most important rebel leaders was Li Zicheng. He had originally been a minor military figure, but as famine and disorder spread, his movement grew. Peasants joined. Soldiers defected. The government struggled to contain the rebellion, and the Ming Emperor Chongzhen found himself increasingly isolated. The emperor was not necessarily lazy. In fact, Chongzhen worked intensely. He issued orders. He punished officials. He tried to reform the government. He changed commanders. He demanded results. But by then, the structural problems were too large. A ruler cannot simply work harder and expect a collapsing system to become healthy. Sometimes the machine is broken, and the person sitting at the controls can only pull so many levers. In 1644, Li Zicheng's forces entered Beijing. The emperor climbed a hill near the palace. He understood that the dynasty was finished. He ordered members of his family to die. Then he took his own life. The Ming Dynasty had fallen. But the story was not over, because beyond the Great Wall another power was waiting. The Manchus. They had built their own state in the northeast. Their leader Nurhaci had united various Jurchen groups and established the foundation of what would become the Qing Dynasty. His successors continued expanding. They developed a sophisticated military and administrative system, and they were already prepared to intervene in China. When the Ming general Wu Sangui opened the Shanhai Pass to the Manchu forces, the situation changed rapidly. The Manchus entered China. They defeated Li Zicheng. They took Beijing. And in 1644, the Qing Dynasty began its conquest. This was another moment when China was ruled by outsiders. But the Manchus understood something the Mongols had also understood. To rule China, they needed Chinese institutions. They adopted much of the existing bureaucracy. They retained the examination system. They used Confucian political language. They presented themselves as legitimate emperors. But they also preserved Manchu identity. The Qing rulers were not simply Chinese rulers with a different family name. They were conquerors who created a multi-ethnic empire. That distinction would matter enormously. The early Qing rulers faced resistance. Some Ming loyalists continued fighting. In southern China, resistance persisted for decades. There were sieges, battles, executions, massacres, and eventually the Qing established control. The new rulers were determined to prevent rebellion. They enforced distinctive policies. One of the most famous was the Q Order. Han Chinese men were required to adopt the Manchu hairstyle, shaving the front of the head and wearing a long braid. For the Qing government, this was more than fashion. It was a visible sign of submission. For many people, it became a symbol of humiliation. Resistance could be punished severely. The message was simple. The old dynasty is gone. The new ruler is here. Accept it. And eventually, most people did. Not because they suddenly loved the Manchus, but because life continued. Children were born under Qing rule. They grew up knowing no other emperor. A new generation learned the new rituals. New officials entered the bureaucracy. New families became successful. And within a few decades, the Qing state had begun to feel less like a foreign occupation and more like an established dynasty. The first great Qing emperor was Kangxi. He came to the throne as a child in 1661. His reign would last for more than 60 years. Imagine that. A child becomes emperor, and remains emperor long enough to become an old man. Kangxi eventually became one of the most capable rulers in Chinese history. He consolidated Qing control. He defeated major rebellions. He expanded the empire. He encouraged scholarship. He personally studied. He traveled. He inspected regions of the empire. He cultivated the image of a Confucian ruler. And he ruled over an empire that was becoming enormous. The Qing conquered Taiwan. They fought against the Dzungars. They expanded into Inner Asia. They established control over Tibet in complex ways. They strengthened relationships with Mongolia. The empire became a vast multi-ethnic political structure. Chinese, Manchu, Mongol, Tibetan, Muslim communities in Central Asia, different peoples, different languages, different traditions. The Qing rulers did not simply erase these differences. They managed them, sometimes through military force, sometimes through separate administrative systems, sometimes through religious patronage, sometimes through negotiation. The empire was held together by a complicated mixture of identities. And then came Kangxi's successor, Yongzheng. His reign was shorter but intensely administrative. He reformed taxation, strengthened government finances, tightened control over officials, and attempted to reduce corruption. He worked long hours. Again, the emperor and paperwork, a relationship as old as bureaucracy itself. Then came Qianlong. He would reign for much of the 18th century. Under Qianlong, Qing China reached its greatest territorial extent. The empire was wealthy. The population was enormous. Agriculture was productive. Trade flourished. The court sponsored art and scholarship. Qianlong presented himself as a great universal ruler. He wrote poetry. He collected paintings. He patronized temples. He commissioned enormous literary projects. One of the largest was the complete library of the 4 branches of knowledge, an enormous collection and cataloging project. It represented the confidence of the 18th century Qing state. China was not simply prosperous. It believed itself to be the center of a civilized world. And from the perspective of the time, this confidence was not entirely irrational. China was one of the world's largest economies. Its population was enormous. The cities were wealthy. Its cultural traditions were ancient. Its government was sophisticated. Europe was powerful, but China did not necessarily see Europe as a superior civilization. When European envoys arrived, the Qing court expected them to participate in established diplomatic rituals. The British mission led by Lord Macartney in 1793 is famous. The British wanted expanded trade. The Qing court was not particularly interested. The emperor's response essentially reflected confidence that China did not need much from Britain. This confidence would soon become dangerous, because Britain was changing. Europe was changing. Industrialization was accelerating. Factories were transforming production. Steam power was changing transportation. Military technology was evolving. Global trade was expanding. And China was about to encounter an entirely new kind of pressure. Not another nomadic confederation. Not a rival agricultural kingdom, but industrial maritime empires. The old imperial world had survived for 2,000 years by adapting to neighboring powers. Now the neighborhood itself was changing, and the Qing court did not yet understand how quickly. By the beginning of the 19th century, the empire was still enormous, still confident, still filled with millions of farmers, still governed by officials who studied ancient texts, still centered around an emperor in Beijing. The palaces were still there. The rituals were still there. The examinations were still there. The old roads were still there. The Great Wall still crossed the mountains. But outside the empire, steamships were beginning to appear. And a steamship is a strange thing to see if your world has been built around horses, sails, rivers, and human labor. It moves against the wind. It does not wait for favorable currents. Carries enormous quantities of goods. And it can carry guns. That last detail would become particularly important, because one of the goods Britain wanted to sell to China was opium. Opium was grown in British-controlled India and sold illegally into China. The trade drained silver from China and created serious social problems. The Qing government tried to stop it. In 1839, Commissioner Lin Zexu took decisive action in Canton. He confiscated and destroyed large quantities of opium. The British government responded with military force. The First Opium War began. And suddenly the Qing Empire was facing something it had not anticipated. British ships, modern artillery, steam-powered vessels, industrial military logistics. The old empire could still field huge armies. But the technological gap was becoming impossible to ignore. Chinese coastal defenses were overwhelmed. The war ended with the Treaty of Nanjing in 1842. China ceded Hong Kong Island to Britain. Several ports were open to foreign trade. The treaty became the first of what Chinese history would later remember as the unequal treaties. And with that, a new era began. The Qing Emperor was still on the throne. The imperial bureaucracy still functioned. The Forbidden City still stood. The examinations continued. The rituals continued. But the world had changed. The empire was no longer operating in a political environment it could control. Foreign powers could force concessions. Missionaries entered. Merchants arrived. Gunboats appeared. Treaty ports grew. Foreign settlements emerged. And inside China, people began asking a terrifying question. If the old order is no longer protecting us, what is it worth? The answer would not be simple. Some wanted reform. Some wanted revolution. Some wanted stronger traditional government. Some blamed foreigners. Some blamed corrupt officials. Some blamed the emperor. And some believed the entire imperial system had to disappear. The Qing would survive for decades. But the crisis had begun. The 19th century would bring enormous rebellions. The Taiping movement, the Nian Rebellion, Muslim rebellions in various regions, conflicts with foreign powers, the Sino-Japanese War, the Boxer movement. The imperial court would repeatedly attempt reform, sometimes too late, sometimes too cautiously, sometimes with remarkable energy. But the pressure would continue. The old world was approaching its final century. And somewhere inside Beijing, behind the walls of the Forbidden City, the last generations of emperors would continue performing rituals designed for a world that no longer existed. Outside those walls, railways would appear. Telegraph wires would stretch across the country. Foreign armies would enter. Modern schools would open. Revolutionary ideas would spread. And young Chinese intellectuals would begin looking toward something that had once seemed almost unimaginable. A China without an emperor. But before the dragon throne finally disappears, the Qing will have to endure some of the greatest upheavals in its long history. The next storm will come from within. Millions will die. Cities will burn. The countryside will be devastated. And a man claiming to be the younger brother of Jesus Christ will attempt to create a new heavenly kingdom in China. His name is Han Dynasty, and his rebellion will become one of the deadliest conflicts of the 19th century. The empire is not finished yet, but the walls are beginning to crack. And when the night wind passes through the empty courtyards of the Forbidden City, it carries with it a sound that the emperors cannot quite hear. The sound of a world changing, slowly, relentlessly, one generation at a time. The Qing Empire, rebellion, foreign guns, and the end of the dragon throne. The 19th century begins quietly, at least from inside the Forbidden City. Morning light falls across the palace roofs. The golden tiles glow beneath a pale winter sky. Servants move through the courtyards. Officials arrive with documents. The emperor performs rituals. The great machinery of the Qing state continues to move. Tax records are copied. Grain is counted. Petitions are read. Appointments are made. The examination system continues producing generations of scholar officials. Across the countryside, farmers plow their fields. Merchants travel between market towns. Families celebrate weddings. Children are born. Old people die. The rhythms of ordinary life continue. And this is what makes the coming crisis so difficult to see. Empires rarely collapse because everyone wakes up one morning and decides they are finished. Usually, the system continues functioning long after its foundations have begun to crack. The Qing Empire at the beginning of the 19th century was still enormous, still wealthy, still culturally confident. still governed by one of the most sophisticated bureaucratic systems in the world. The Qianlong Emperor had ruled for decades. His reign had witnessed expansion, prosperity, and extraordinary cultural production. But behind the magnificence was a growing problem: population. China's population had risen dramatically. More people meant more workers, more farmers, more soldiers, more consumers. Could also mean more mouths competing for land. The agricultural frontier had expanded. New crops from the Americas had spread through the countryside. Sweet potatoes and maize could grow in difficult soils. Peanuts added nutrition. These crops helped support enormous population growth. But land did not multiply. A family that once held enough farmland for 3 generations might eventually divide it among 6 sons. Then 12 grandchildren. Then more. Plots became smaller. Debt became more common. Tenant farming expanded. And when harvests failed, poverty could become desperate. The Qing government still depended heavily on agriculture, but its ability to respond to local crises was uneven. Officials varied enormously in competence. Some were honest. Some were corrupt. Some worked tirelessly. Some treated their office as an opportunity to enrich themselves. Again, history offers very few perfect bureaucracies. The Qing state was also dealing with corruption at higher levels. One notorious example was He Xin, a powerful official who became extraordinarily wealthy through corruption and influence. He accumulated enormous fortunes. The emperor tolerated him for years. When Qianlong died and He Xin's protection disappeared, he was arrested. His wealth was seized. The scale of the fortune was staggering. It became a symbol of the corruption that had infected parts of the late Qing system. But corruption was only one problem. There was also foreign trade. For centuries, European merchants had wanted greater access to Chinese markets. The Qing court had generally preferred a controlled system. Foreign merchants were restricted. Trade was concentrated in designated areas. The Chinese government saw foreign trade as something to regulate rather than something that should dictate national policy. Then Britain developed a powerful appetite for Chinese goods: tea, silk, porcelain. Europeans wanted them in enormous quantities. But China did not need many British manufactured goods. The result was a trade imbalance. Silver flowed into China. The British wanted to reverse that flow. They found a solution: opium. The drug was grown in British-controlled India. It was smuggled into China. Chinese consumers bought it. Silver flowed out. Addiction spread. The Qing government knew what was happening. Officials debated the response. Some argued that the economic damage was the greatest problem. Others focused on addiction. Some suggested legalizing and taxing the drug. Others demanded prohibition. The debate eventually produced action. Commissioner Lin Zexu was sent to Guangzhou. He was determined. He ordered foreign merchants to surrender their opium. They resisted. Eventually, large quantities were confiscated. It was mixed with lime and salt and rendered unusable. From the Qing perspective, this was law enforcement. From the British perspective, it was an attack on British commercial interests. The British government sent military forces. And now the Qing Empire encountered the Industrial Age. British warships moved along the coast. Chinese forces fought bravely in many places. But bravery could not solve a technological imbalance. British ships were faster. Their artillery was more effective. Their logistics were more sophisticated. Their naval power allowed them to attack where they chose. The war ended in 1842. The Treaty of Nanjing followed. Hong Kong Island was ceded to Britain. Several treaty ports were opened. Foreign trade received greater access. The Qing government paid an indemnity. The treaty was humiliating. But perhaps more important than the specific concessions was the psychological impact. China had lost. Not to another step empire, not to a neighboring kingdom, but to a relatively small European power whose industrial and naval technology had allowed it to impose terms. The old assumption of Chinese centrality was shaken. Foreign powers noticed, and they wanted their own concessions. Other Western states demanded treaties. France became active. The United States established commercial relations. Russia expanded its influence in the north. And Japan, observing China's difficulties, began its own transformation. The Qing government attempted limited reforms. But the internal problems were becoming more severe. And then, in the 1850s, an extraordinary religious movement erupted. Its leader was Hong Xiuquan. Hong had failed the imperial examinations several times. He was deeply disappointed. After becoming ill, he experienced visions. He interpreted them through Christian teachings that had reached China through missionaries. Eventually, he came to believe that he was the younger brother of Jesus Christ. Yes, that is the kind of sentence history occasionally produces without asking permission. Hong developed a religious movement. He preached that China was corrupt, that the existing order was illegitimate, that a new heavenly kingdom should be established. His followers became known as the Taiping. Their movement spread rapidly. The Taiping forces expanded. They captured cities. And in 1853, they captured Nanjing. They renamed it Tianjin, the heavenly capital. For a time, it appeared possible that the Qing Dynasty might actually fall. The Taiping movement was not simply a peasant revolt. It created an alternative government. It imposed rules. It attempted social reform. It promoted a strict religious ideology. Private property was challenged. Gender roles were reorganized. Traditional Confucian institutions were attacked. The Taiping leaders claimed to be creating a new heavenly order. But the movement was also deeply authoritarian. Its leadership became divided. Internal struggles intensified. The movement committed atrocities. The Qing government responded with equally brutal force. The resulting conflict became one of the deadliest civil wars in human history. The numbers are difficult to establish precisely, but tens of millions of people died from warfare, famine, disease, and displacement. Entire regions were devastated. Villages disappeared. Fields were abandoned. Cities were destroyed. Imagine a farming village before the rebellion. A few dozen houses. A small shrine. Rice paddies. Children playing. A road leading toward the market. Then soldiers arrive. Perhaps the government army. Perhaps rebels. Perhaps both at different times. People flee. The houses are burned. The fields are trampled. The grain is taken. The shrine is destroyed. The road remains. And later, perhaps years later, someone returns. The village is gone. Only weeds remain. This is the human scale of rebellion. Political maps show arrows. History books show battles. But the countryside experiences war as empty kitchens and silent houses. The Qing government eventually defeated the Taiping. Much of the fighting was carried out not by the central government alone, but by regional armies organized by Chinese officials and local elites. One of the most important was Zheng Guofan. He organized the Hunan army. Other commanders followed. Regional military power increased. This would later create another problem. The central government had survived partly by empowering local forces. But now those local forces possessed significant independent influence. Again, the old imperial problem returned. To save the state, you sometimes have to give power to people who may eventually threaten it. The Qing survived, but it was weakened. And while China was fighting itself, foreign powers continued applying pressure. The Second Opium War erupted in the 1850s. British and French forces attacked. Beijing was threatened. The old summer palace was looted and burned in 1860. The destruction became a symbol of humiliation. The Qing court was forced into further concessions. Foreign powers gained greater access. Missionaries expanded their presence. Foreign settlements developed. Treaty ports became strange hybrid spaces. Chinese and foreign residents lived side by side but under different legal systems. Foreigners in certain areas enjoyed extraterritorial rights. This meant that Chinese law did not fully apply to them. From the Chinese perspective, sovereignty was being carved away. But the Qing government still had enormous territory, and some officials began arguing that China needed to modernize. This led to what historians call the self-strengthening movement. The idea was straightforward: preserve traditional Chinese political and moral foundations, adopt Western technology where useful, learn modern military techniques, build arsenals, develop shipyards, create modern schools, study foreign languages, improve industry. In other words, keep the old civilization, borrow the machines. It was an understandable strategy, and in some areas it worked. Modern arsenals were built, military academies appeared, foreign instructors were hired, shipyards were developed, telegraph lines were constructed, modern schools were established, railways began appearing. But modernization was uneven, and there was a deeper problem. Technology cannot easily be separated from the institutions that produce it. Modern weapons require industrial production. Industrial production requires finance. Finance requires modern administration. Modern administration requires new kinds of education. New education changes political ideas. Political ideas change expectations. And suddenly, you are no longer merely buying a machine. You are importing a new world. The Qing court struggled with this. Then came Japan. Japan had undergone the Meiji Restoration beginning in 1868. The Japanese government moved rapidly toward industrialization and military modernization. Railways expanded. Factories were built. A modern conscript army was created. Western technologies were adopted. Japan became increasingly powerful. China and Japan then collided over Korea. For centuries, Korea had been within the Chinese tributary sphere. Japan wanted greater influence. The rivalry intensified. In 1894, war broke out. The First Sino-Japanese War was a disaster for Qing China. The Japanese military demonstrated modern organization and technology. Chinese forces were defeated. The war ended with the Treaty of Shimonoseki in 1895. China recognized Korean independence. Taiwan was ceded to Japan. Other concessions were made. The humiliation was enormous. A neighboring Asian country that China had traditionally regarded as culturally junior had defeated the Qing military. This was not merely a military defeat. It was an intellectual shock. If Japan could modernize successfully, why couldn't China? The debate intensified. Reformers demanded political change. Some wanted constitutional government. Some wanted stronger modernization. Some wanted to preserve the emperor but transform the state. Others increasingly believed that the monarchy itself had to go. The Guangxu Emperor supported reform. In 1898, the 100 Days Reform began. The reformers wanted changes to education, government, administration, and the military. But conservative forces resisted. The Empress Dowager Cixi emerged as the dominant political figure. She had been a concubine who rose to extraordinary power after giving birth to the emperor's son. For decades, she had influenced Qing politics. Now she moved against the reformers. The 100 Days Reform collapsed. Some reformers were executed. Others fled. The emperor was effectively confined. The opportunity for gradual political transformation had been lost. And then another movement appeared. The Boxers. They were anti-foreign and anti-Christian. They believed spiritual practices could protect them from bullets. Their movement gained support among some local officials and eventually elements of the Qing court. Foreigners were attacked. Chinese Christians were attacked. Missionaries were targeted. The crisis escalated. In 1900, foreign troops moved toward Beijing. The Eight-Nation Alliance intervened. The siege of foreign legations in Beijing became a major international crisis. The Qing court ultimately fled the capital. Beijing was occupied. More concessions followed. The Boxer Protocol of 1901 imposed enormous financial penalties and further restrictions. The dynasty had survived again. But each survival came at a greater cost. The empire was becoming weaker. Foreign powers had established spheres of influence. Russia occupied territory. Britain expanded its influence. France controlled areas in Southeast Asia. Germany held territory around Qingdao. Japan controlled Taiwan. Foreign concessions dotted the coast. Railways connected parts of the country, often under foreign control. China remained politically independent, but its sovereignty was increasingly compromised. Inside the empire, young intellectuals were becoming impatient. They read about republicanism, nationalism, socialism, constitutional government, revolution. They studied Japan, Europe, America. They debated China's future. One of the most important figures was Sun Yat-sen. Sun believed that China needed revolutionary transformation. He developed a political philosophy based on the three principles of the people: nationalism, democracy, people's livelihood. He traveled widely. He organized revolutionary groups. He raised money overseas. He failed repeatedly. Revolutions were attempted. Many were crushed. Some conspirators were arrested. Some were executed. But the idea spread. The emperor's legitimacy was no longer unquestioned. The Qing court attempted late reforms. A constitution was promised. New schools were established. The examination system, which had shaped Chinese elite culture for centuries, was abolished in 1905. That was an enormous symbolic change. For generations, ambitious young men had dreamed of passing the examinations. Families had invested years in preparing sons. The examination halls had produced officials. The classics had formed the intellectual backbone of the state. Now the system was gone. Imagine being an elderly scholar who had spent your life believing that mastery of the classics was the path to serving the empire. And suddenly, the government announces that the old examinations are finished. The world has changed beneath your feet. A new generation would study mathematics, science, engineering, foreign languages, military science, political theory. The intellectual foundations of the empire were shifting. Then came 1911. A revolution began in Wuchang. The uprising spread. Provincial governments declared independence from the Qing. The dynasty's authority collapsed with astonishing speed. The imperial government tried to respond. Yuan Shikai, one of the most powerful military and political figures in China, was brought back into politics. Negotiations began. The young Shentong Emperor Puyi was still a child. He was only a boy. He had been placed on the throne in 1908. His reign would be brief. On February 12, 1912, the Qing Dynasty formally ended. After more than 2.5 centuries of Manchu rule, the empire was gone. After more than 2,000 years of imperial monarchy, the throne itself was gone. The dragon throne had fallen. Think about what that means. The same basic institution had survived dynastic changes since ancient times. Qin, Han, Sui, Tang, Song, Yuan, Ming, Qing. Different families, different ethnic backgrounds, different philosophies, different borders, different religions. But one central idea had remained remarkably persistent. China was governed by an emperor. Now there was no emperor. The last emperor was a child, Puyi. He would remain inside the Forbidden City for a time. He would still perform ceremonies. He would still have servants. He would still be called emperor within the palace. But outside the walls, the Republic had been proclaimed. The old world and the new world existed side by side. Inside, the boy emperor lived among rituals that had been practiced for centuries. Outside, a republic was trying to understand what it meant to govern a country that had just lost its imperial center. And so the story of Imperial China, in the political sense, had reached its end. But the story of China had not ended. Far from it. The empire had collapsed. The civilization had not. The written language remained. The families remained. The cities remained. The rivers remained. The mountains remained. The old temples remained. The memories remained. And the people who had lived through imperial rule would carry those memories into the 20th century. Some would miss the old order. Some would celebrate its disappearance. Some would feel nothing except exhaustion. For a farmer, the end of the Qing might not immediately change the price of rice. For a merchant, the market still opened. For a child, the next morning still arrived. History had changed the name of the government. But life continued. That may be the quietest truth of all. Empires rise and fall. Dynasties announce new eras. Generals declare victories. Rebels proclaim new kingdoms. Foreign armies cross borders. Emperors receive ambassadors. Then emperors disappear. And yet the ordinary human world continues. People wake. They cook. They work. They argue. They marry. They bury their dead. They raise children. They worry about money. They look at the weather. They watch the moon. They wonder what tomorrow will bring. 2,000 years of Imperial China had been built from those ordinary lives. The emperors were only the most visible part. Beneath every palace stood millions of people whose names history never recorded. Farmers who planted grain. Women who spun thread. Craftsmen who carved wood. Workers who carried bricks. Soldiers who guarded walls. Merchants who crossed deserts. Monks who walked mountain roads. Scholars who copied texts by hand. Children who died young. Parents who mourned them. Old people who remembered wars that younger generations could barely imagine. The empire was all of them, not only the emperors. And perhaps that is why the story lasted so long. Because dynasties could change. But the civilization continually rebuilt itself. When Qin fell, Han emerged. When Han fragmented, Sui reunited the land. When Sui collapsed, Tang rose. When Tang fell, Song created new forms of prosperity. When Song disappeared, Yuan ruled. When Yuan collapsed, Ming rebuilt. When Ming fell, Qing took the throne. And when Qing disappeared, something entirely new began. The pattern was never perfect. It was never inevitable. But it was persistent. A civilization repeatedly reinventing its political structure while carrying pieces of the past forward. And now, as we leave the imperial age behind, imagine the Forbidden City at night. The courtyards are quiet. The gates are closed. The palace roofs disappear into darkness. A cold wind moves across the stone. There are no crowds. No imperial procession. No officials rushing toward an audience. No emperor waiting behind a screen. Only the buildings remain. Wood, stone, tile, paint, and memory. The palace does not know that the dynasty is gone. The walls do not care. The moonlight falls exactly as it did centuries earlier. Perhaps somewhere, a watchman hears the wind. Perhaps a cat moves across a courtyard. Perhaps a single lantern burns. And if you stand there long enough, you can almost imagine the voices of the centuries. Qin soldiers marching. Han officials whispering. Tang poets drinking beneath the moon. Song merchants counting coins. Mongol horsemen crossing the plains. Ming workers carrying bricks toward the mountains. Qing officials entering the palace. Rebels shouting in distant streets. Foreign guns firing from the coast. And finally, the silence after the emperor leaves. 2,000 years. An almost unimaginable length of time. Enough time for languages to change. For cities to disappear. For rivers to change course. For mountains to remain. For families to rise and vanish. For entire dynasties to become memories. And still the story continues. Because history does not truly end. It simply changes who gets to write the next chapter. The imperial age is over. But the old roads remain beneath the modern streets. The old canals still carry water. The old characters still appear on pages. The old poems are still read. The old temples still receive visitors. The old walls still catch the evening light. And perhaps, somewhere beneath all the political changes, there is a quiet continuity. The belief that the past is worth remembering, that ancestors still matter, that order is fragile, that power is temporary, that prosperity can disappear, that a ruler who believes himself permanent is probably already mistaken, and that every dynasty, no matter how confident, eventually becomes history. So as the night grows deeper, let the imperial centuries slowly fade. The palaces become distant, the armies become quiet, the drums stop, the banners disappear, the roads empty, the lanterns dim, and one by one, the emperors return to the silence from which history briefly pulled them. Qin Shi Huang, Han rulers, Tang emperors, Song scholars, Mongol Khans, Ming emperors, Qing rulers, all gone. What remains is the enormous human story beneath them, a story of survival, ambition, suffering, beauty, invention, faith, war, family, and time. Perhaps that is the most peaceful way to understand Imperial China. Not as a procession of great men, not as an endless list of battles, but as millions upon millions of ordinary nights. A farmer closing the door of his house, a mother feeding her child, a scholar reading beneath a lamp, a soldier watching the frontier, a merchant resting beside a caravan, a monk walking through the mountains, a poet looking at the moon, an old woman remembering a dynasty that no longer exists, a child falling asleep without knowing that history is changing around him. And above them all, the same moon, the moon that watched Qin rise, the moon that watched Han flourish, the moon over Tang Chong'an, the moon above Song Hangzhou, the moon over Mongol armies, the moon shining on Ming walls, the moon reflected in Qing palace ponds, the moon above the Forbidden City after the emperor was gone. It never needed to choose a dynasty. It simply kept moving across the sky. And perhaps, after 2,000 years, that is the image worth keeping. The empire changed. The world changed. Human beings changed. But night still came. And morning always followed. So let the palace doors close. Let the last lantern flicker. Let the sound of distant footsteps disappear. The long imperial story has ended. For tonight, at least. And somewhere beyond the walls of the old capital, the first light of another morning is beginning to appear. Quietly. Almost unnoticed. Just as history so often begins. And just as you can now let the story drift away. Slowly. Softly. Into the darkness. After the emperor, the long shadow of Imperial China. The emperor is gone. And yet, for a while, almost nothing looks different. The Forbidden City still stands. The palace roofs still shine beneath the Beijing sky. The courtyards are still arranged according to ancient rules of hierarchy. The old imperial clocks still tick. Servants still move quietly through the compounds. And inside those walls sits a small boy named Puyi, the last emperor of China. He is not yet old enough to understand the full meaning of what has happened. Outside, the Republic of China has been proclaimed. The imperial government has collapsed. The ancient political order has been declared finished. But inside the palace, the child emperor continues to live among the ceremonies of another age. He is still dressed as an emperor. He is still addressed with imperial titles. He is still surrounded by people whose entire lives have been shaped by the old system. And perhaps that is the strangest part of the transition. History announces a revolution, but daily life changes slowly. The empire has disappeared on paper. The habits of empire remain. For centuries, Chinese society had been organized around the assumption that political authority flowed downward from the throne. The emperor appointed officials. Officials governed provinces. Provincial authorities supervised counties. County officials dealt with villages. Families interacted with local officials. Taxes moved upward. Orders moved downward. Information traveled in both directions, at least in theory. Now the throne was empty, but the bureaucracy had not suddenly vanished. The roads remained. The tax offices remained. The schools remained. The habits of administration remained. The people remained. And most importantly, the question of how China should be governed remained. The revolutionaries had achieved something extraordinary. They had ended imperial rule. But ending a system is easier than replacing it. Sun Yat-sen became the provisional president of the new republic. But military power remained in the hands of Yuan Shikai. Yuan was a formidable figure. He had served the Qing government. He had built a powerful military organization. And he understood that political power in the new China would not come from ideals alone. It would come from soldiers. Negotiations followed. Sun Yat-sen eventually stepped aside. Yuan became president. The new republic struggled. There were political parties, parliamentary institutions, constitutional experiments, political arguments, and, inevitably, military competition. The old imperial structure had kept China politically unified, however imperfectly. Now regional military leaders gained influence. Warlords emerged. China entered a period of fragmentation. And once again, the old pattern appeared. Central authority weakened. Regional armies became powerful. Taxes were collected locally. Different commanders controlled different territories. Ordinary people found themselves living beneath governments that could change depending on which army had arrived. It was a familiar nightmare wearing modern clothes. The 20th century, however, brought something new: nationalism. The Chinese people were no longer simply subjects of an emperor. They were increasingly imagined as citizens of a nation. This was a profound change. For centuries, political identity had been tied to dynasty. You lived under Han rule, or Tang rule, or Ming rule, or Qing rule. Now people increasingly asked a different question. What does it mean to be Chinese? The answer was not obvious. China contained many peoples, many languages, many regional cultures, many religious traditions, many historical memories. The new republic had inherited an enormous territory from the Qing. But exactly how that territory should be understood was contested. The concept of the nation had to be created. And creating a nation is not a simple matter of changing the flag. It requires schools, newspapers, maps, national holidays, military service, shared symbols, shared stories. A new generation had to be taught to imagine itself as part of a common political community. The old imperial examinations had already disappeared. In their place came modern education. Students studied mathematics, science, geography, political theory, foreign languages, and increasingly they read newspapers. The printing press had already transformed Chinese society during earlier centuries. Now modern mass media accelerated the process. Ideas moved rapidly. Revolutionary arguments spread. Political movements organized. Young people debated the future in cafes and classrooms. And among the most important questions was whether China should imitate the West. Some said yes. Others said China needed its own path. Some wanted democracy. Others wanted socialism. Some wanted nationalism. Some wanted a return to traditional values. Some wanted to destroy the old traditions completely. The intellectual world became turbulent. And then, in 1919, the May 4th movement erupted. Students in Beijing protested against the decisions made at the Paris Peace Conference. They were angry that Chinese interests had been sacrificed. But their movement quickly became something larger. It became a cultural and intellectual rebellion. Young people questioned Confucianism. They demanded modernization. They advocated science and democracy. They criticized traditional social structures. They wanted a new China. For some, this meant freedom. For others, revolution. And in the background, a new political ideology was gaining influence: Marxism. The Chinese Communist Party was founded in 1921. Its early members were few, but the political environment was changing rapidly. The Nationalist Party, or Kuomintang, sought to unify China. Sun Yat-sen worked with various groups. After his death in 1925, the nationalists were increasingly led by Chiang Kai-shek. The nationalist government launched the Northern Expedition. Its goal was to defeat the warlords and reunify China. The campaign achieved significant success. Nanjing became the center of a new nationalist government. For a time, China appeared to be moving toward stability. But the relationship between nationalists and communists collapsed. Violence followed. The Chinese Civil War began, and then another crisis arrived: Japan. Japan had already defeated Qing China decades earlier. It had taken Taiwan. It had expanded into Korea. It had developed a powerful modern military. Now Japanese expansion turned toward mainland China. In 1931, Japan seized Manchuria. A puppet state called Manchukuo was established. The last emperor, Puyi, was brought back into politics. The boy who had once been the emperor of China became the nominal ruler of Manchukuo. It was a strange and tragic transformation. He had gone from emperor of one of the world's oldest political traditions to figurehead ruler under Japanese control. The man who had once lived in the Forbidden City now occupied a throne created by an occupying power. History can be brutally ironic. In 1937, full-scale war between China and Japan erupted. The conflict became catastrophic. Japanese forces captured major cities. Nanjing fell. What followed became known as the Nanjing Massacre. Civilians were killed. Prisoners were executed. Women were subjected to horrific sexual violence. The exact number of victims remains debated, but the scale of the atrocity was enormous. The war devastated China. Millions died. Millions more became refugees. Cities were bombed. Villages were destroyed. Families were separated. Food became scarce. Disease spread. The war lasted for years. And yet, beneath the catastrophe, the Chinese state continued to function in fragmented form. The nationalists maintained a wartime government. The communists expanded their rural base. Both fought Japan. Both prepared for the struggle that would resume after Japan's defeat. In 1945, Japan surrendered. The Second World War ended. But China was exhausted. The Civil War resumed. The communist forces grew stronger. The nationalist government struggled with inflation, corruption, military fatigue, and loss of popular support. In 1949, communist forces entered Beijing. Mao Zedong proclaimed the People's Republic of China. The nationalist government retreated to Taiwan. Another political era had begun. The imperial past now seemed extremely distant, but it had not disappeared. It was everywhere. In the language, in the bureaucracy, in the cities, in the social habits, in the family structure, in historical memory, in the political imagination. Even the idea of China as a unified civilization stretching across enormous territory had deep imperial roots. The new government rejected the monarchy. It rejected the old aristocracy. It attacked many traditional institutions. But it also inherited the administrative challenge that every dynasty had faced. How do you govern China? The population was enormous. The territory was vast. Regional differences were significant. Agriculture remained crucial. Infrastructure needed development. Education needed expansion. And the state needed to reach villages that had once been governed indirectly through local elites. The communist government attempted something extraordinarily ambitious. It sought to transform Chinese society. Land reform redistributed land. Traditional landlords were attacked. The state expanded its control. Then came collectivization. Agricultural production was reorganized. Industry was nationalized. The government pursued rapid industrial development. The Great Leap Forward attempted to transform China into a modern industrial power. The consequences were disastrous. Agricultural production collapsed in many areas. Famine spread. Millions of people died. The government eventually retreated from some of the most extreme policies. But another upheaval followed. The Cultural Revolution. Beginning in 1966, Mao encouraged young people to attack what were described as the Four Olds. Old customs, old culture, old habits, old ideas. Schools were disrupted. Teachers were humiliated. Intellectuals were attacked. Historical artifacts were destroyed. Families were divided. Political struggle entered everyday life. The irony was extraordinary. China had spent thousands of years preserving classical texts, rituals, historical records, and traditions. Now some of those traditions were being treated as enemies. And yet history has a strange habit. You can attack the past. You can burn books. You can destroy temples. You can denounce ancestors. But you cannot completely erase memory. Eventually, the political atmosphere changed. Mao died in 1976. The Cultural Revolution ended, and a new era began. Deng Xiaoping emerged as the dominant leader. The reforms that followed transformed China. Collective agriculture was reduced. Private enterprise expanded. Foreign investment increased. Special economic zones were established. China opened more deeply to global trade. Factories multiplied. Cities expanded. Hundreds of millions of people moved from rural areas into urban environments. The economy transformed at astonishing speed. And once again, China adapted. The civilization that had once been governed by emperors was now becoming one of the world's major industrial powers. Yet beneath the skyscrapers, the old landscape remained. Villages still stood beside ancient mountains. Old temples survived. Family rituals continued. Chinese classics were studied again. Confucius, once condemned during political campaigns, returned to public cultural life. The past had survived. Not unchanged. Never unchanged. But alive. Today, when we look at China, it can be tempting to think only of modern cities. Shanghai, Beijing, Shenzhen, Guangzhou. Skyscrapers, high-speed trains, factories, digital technology, crowded streets. But beneath the modern landscape lies an extraordinarily deep historical layer. The roads built for imperial armies. The canals that once carried grain to imperial capitals. The city walls that defined ancient urban life. The examination halls that produced generations of officials. The temples where people prayed through dynastic changes. The family records that connect living people to ancestors centuries ago. The poems still memorized in classrooms. The characters written on signs. The festivals that survived governments. The food traditions that cross dynasties. And the idea that history itself matters. Perhaps this is the greatest legacy of Imperial China. Not simply that emperors ruled for 2,000 years. But that Chinese civilization developed an extraordinary habit of remembering itself. Dynasties recorded previous dynasties. Historians wrote histories of earlier rulers. Officials preserved documents. Scholars copied texts. Families maintained genealogies. Monasteries preserved scriptures. Libraries collected books. Even when dynasties fell, the memory of those dynasties often survived. The Chinese historical tradition, therefore, became almost recursive. History wrote history, and later historians wrote histories of those historians. A dynasty would fall. A new dynasty would rise. The new government would commission an official history of the old one. The old dynasty would be judged. The successes would be praised. Its failures explained. Its corruption condemned. Its final emperor would become a warning. And then the new dynasty would begin making many of the same mistakes. Because apparently humans require several thousand years of evidence before accepting that power tends to corrupt. The imperial political system also left another enormous legacy. The educated bureaucracy. For centuries, government service had been associated with scholarship. The ideal official was someone who could read, write, reason, remember, and administer. This created a culture in which education became deeply connected with social advancement. Families invested in children. Parents hoped sons would succeed. Even after the examination system disappeared, the cultural emphasis on education remained. A child studying late at night beneath a lamp is therefore not simply a modern image. It belongs to a much older tradition. The lamp has changed. The books have changed. The subjects have changed. But the basic scene remains. A child. A desk. A difficult text. A family hoping for a better future. That continuity is remarkable. The imperial system also shaped China's relationship with geography. The great rivers became political arteries. The Yellow River, the Yangtze, the Grand Canal. These were not merely natural features. They were infrastructure. They determined where grain moved, where cities grew, where armies marched, where governments established capitals, where people settled. The state constantly fought against floods, especially along the Yellow River. Dikes had to be maintained, canals dredged, bridges repaired, embankments rebuilt. A flood was not just a natural disaster. It could become a political crisis. If the government failed to control the river, people might interpret the disaster as evidence of political failure. Again, nature and legitimacy were connected. Heaven was always watching, or at least people believed heaven was watching, and that belief mattered. The mandate of heaven created a peculiar political philosophy. A ruler was legitimate because heaven supported him, but heaven's support could be withdrawn. A dynasty therefore had to demonstrate competence. Good harvests helped, peace helped, justice helped, prosperity helped. Disaster, corruption, rebellion, famine, and foreign defeat could all suggest that the mandate was weakening. This made political legitimacy conditional. The emperor might be absolute in theory, but even the emperor existed inside a moral universe. He was expected to behave. He was expected to perform rituals. He was expected to listen to advisors. He was expected to care for the people. And if he failed badly enough, history could eventually declare that heaven had moved on. There was something almost comforting about this idea. Even the emperor was not completely beyond judgment. Power had responsibilities, at least in theory. The imperial system also created an enormous cultural emphasis on family. Filial piety, ancestor worship, family hierarchy, marriage, inheritance. These traditions shaped daily life for centuries. The family was not merely a private unit. It was an economic institution, a social institution, a religious institution, and often a political institution. Families cared for elderly relatives. They arranged marriages. They maintained ancestral graves. They preserved genealogies. They passed down property. They educated children. The state often relied on families to govern themselves. This reduced the burden on the bureaucracy. The emperor could not personally monitor every household, but families could monitor family members. Villages could monitor villages. Communities could maintain order. The result was a society in which government and family were deeply intertwined. This created stability, could also create enormous pressure. A person was expected to fulfill obligations. A son owed his parents. A wife owed her husband's family. An official owed the emperor. A ruler owed heaven. Everyone was connected by duty, and for people who did not fit easily into those expectations, life could be difficult. Women in particular lived within highly restrictive social structures. Their legal and economic rights varied across time and place, but patriarchal expectations were persistent. Foot binding became widespread among many Han Chinese communities, especially among elite and later broader social groups. The practice reshaped women's feet through painful compression. It became associated with beauty, status, and marriageability. From a modern perspective, it is difficult to understand how such a painful practice could become socially normalized. But that is precisely what makes history important. It reminds us that societies can turn suffering into tradition. They can call it beautiful. They can call it proper. They can teach children to accept it. And once a custom becomes embedded in social expectations, individual choice becomes complicated. Not everyone practiced foot binding. Not every woman supported it. But its persistence tells us something about the power of social norms. The empire was therefore not simply a story of grand achievements. It was also a story of inequality. Peasants carried heavy burdens. Women faced restrictions. Minority populations could experience discrimination. Religious communities sometimes faced persecution. Political dissent could be dangerous. Punishments could be severe. The state could be extraordinarily violent. The same government that built canals and libraries could execute rebels. The same civilization that produced exquisite poetry could conduct brutal campaigns. The same bureaucracy that maintained grain stores could enforce oppressive taxes. Human societies rarely fit neatly into categories of good and evil. They contain both. Always. And perhaps this is why the story of Imperial China is so compelling. It refuses to become simple. It is too large, too long, too human. 2,000 years cannot be reduced to a single lesson. There was no single Chinese experience. A farmer in the north lived differently from a merchant in Hangzhou. A monk lived differently from a soldier. A woman in a wealthy family lived differently from a peasant woman. A frontier community experienced empire differently from a family living near the capital. The empire was not one thing. It was millions of experiences connected by institutions. And when we imagine those experiences, the scale becomes almost impossible to comprehend. Generation after generation. A grandfather tells a story to his grandson. The grandson grows old. He tells the same story to his own children. The dynasty changes. The language evolves. The city grows. But some memories survive. Perhaps a family remembers an ancestor who fought in a war. Perhaps a village remembers a flood. Perhaps a temple preserves a story about a local saint. Perhaps a poem is memorized. Perhaps a recipe is passed down. Perhaps a piece of pottery is buried and forgotten for 1,000 years. Then someone digs it up, and suddenly the past is present again. That is what archaeology does. It interrupts forgetting. A roof tile, a bronze vessel, a sword, a coin, a manuscript, a grave, a fragment of pottery. Each object whispers that someone was here. Someone touched this. Someone used it. Someone depended on it. Someone eventually dropped it. And then the earth closed over it. For centuries. Until another pair of human hands found it. The imperial world was filled with such objects. Some belonged to emperors. Most did not. A farmer's bowl may tell us as much about daily life as a royal palace. A child's toy may tell us more about childhood than an official document. A worn cooking pot can reveal what people ate. A damaged tool can reveal how people worked. History is often hidden in ordinary things. And perhaps that is why, when we look back across 2,000 years, the most moving images are not always the great ones. Not the armies. Not the palaces. Not the battles. Sometimes it is a small room, a wooden table, a clay bowl, a lamp, a family eating dinner. Outside, the dynasty is changing. Inside, someone is asking whether there is enough rice for tomorrow. That scene could have happened during Han, Tang, Song, Ming, Qin. The names changed. The clothes changed. The buildings changed. But hunger did not. Love did not. Fear did not. Hope did not. Sleep did not. And neither did the desire for a quiet life. This is perhaps the deepest connection between us and the people of Imperial China. We sometimes imagine ancient people as fundamentally different. But then we find their letters, their poems, their complaints, their jokes, their worries, their shopping lists, their medical records, their family arguments, and suddenly they seem very close. A person living 1,000 years ago could look at the moon and feel lonely. They could worry about an aging parent. They could be excited about a wedding. They could fear war. They could enjoy a warm bowl of food. They could listen to rain. They could fall asleep beside someone they loved. The technology was different. The political system was different. The world was different. But the human heart was not completely transformed. And so the long imperial story ends not with an emperor. It ends with ordinary people, because they were always there, while rulers debated, while armies marched, while dynasties rose, while dynasties fell. They planted, they harvested, they built, they repaired, they cooked, they sang, they mourned, they celebrated, they slept, and then they woke up and did it again. The empire depended on them. Every palace was built by workers. Every army was fed by farmers. Every scholar was supported by a household. Every city depended on merchants and craftsmen. Every dynasty existed because millions of people participated in its economy. The emperor sat at the top, but the empire rested on the shoulders of everyone beneath him. That is perhaps the greatest irony of imperial history. The ruler appears to be the most important person in the system, but the system cannot survive without the people who never meet him. And when those people finally stop cooperating, even the greatest palace becomes strangely fragile. That was true of Qin, Han, Sui, Tang, Yuan, Ming, Qing. It is true of every government. Power looks permanent until it isn't. The palace seems eternal until the gates close for the final time. The throne appears immovable until nobody kneels before it. And the emperor appears almost divine until history writes his name in the past tense. So now, as we reach the end of our long journey, imagine once more the Forbidden City. The night is cool. The courtyards are empty. The great halls rise beneath the stars. The roofs are dark. The stone terraces hold the day's remaining warmth. There are no imperial processions, no ministers waiting for audiences, no eunuchs carrying messages, no soldiers preparing for ceremony, only silence. And in that silence, perhaps we can hear the centuries, a distant drum, the sound of a horse, the call of a market vendor, the whisper of silk, the scratch of a scholar's brush, the clatter of wooden printing blocks, the creak of a cart, the splash of oars on a canal, the hammering of workers building a wall, the chanting of monks, the cries of soldiers, the laughter of children, the sound of rain against a tiled roof. Then gradually all of it fades, not because it never happened, but because time has a way of turning noise into silence. 2,000 years of Imperial China. 2,000 years of rulers trying to create order. 2,000 years of people trying simply to live. 2,000 years of ambition and humility. Of enormous achievements and terrible suffering. Of palaces and villages. Of scholars and soldiers. Of emperors and farmers. Of walls and roads. Of rivers and deserts. Of books and fires. Of beginnings and endings. And perhaps the most remarkable thing is not that the empire lasted so long. It is that so much survived it. The language, the literature, the philosophy, the architecture, the traditions, the food, the memories, the stories, and above all, the people. They carried the past forward, sometimes consciously, sometimes without realizing it. A child memorizes a poem written 1,000 years earlier. A family prepares a dish their ancestors might recognize. A scholar studies a philosopher who died centuries ago. A traveler walks across an old bridge. A modern city grows around ancient foundations. The past does not disappear. It becomes part of the ground beneath the present. And perhaps that is where we should leave Imperial China. Not in the middle of a battle, not at the death of an emperor, not beneath a burning palace, but beneath the quiet moon, because the moon was there for all of it. It watched the first imperial armies. It watched the Han roads. It watched Tang Chang'an. It watched Song merchants. It watched Mongol horsemen. It watched Ming walls rise. It watched Qing palaces glow. And it watched the last emperor leave. The moon never cared which dynasty ruled. It simply rose. Night after night. Century after century. And perhaps that is a comforting thought. Human history can feel enormous. Political struggles can feel permanent. Empires can seem unstoppable. But everything changes. The palace changes. The government changes. The borders change. The language changes. Even memory changes. And still the night arrives. Still the stars appear. Still the wind moves across the rooftops. Still someone somewhere lights a lamp. Still someone somewhere closes a door. Still someone somewhere looks out at the darkness and wonders what tomorrow will bring. So let the ancient roads disappear into the distance now. Let the armies become quiet. Let the palace gates close. Let the names of emperors drift gently into the background. Qin, Han, Sui, Tang, Song, Yuan, Ming, Qing. A long chain of names, a long chain of lives, a long chain of beginnings and endings, and beneath them all, the quiet persistence of ordinary human existence. The empire is gone, but the story remains. And perhaps, after 2,000 years, that is what history was always trying to preserve. Not power, not wealth, not glory, memory. The simple declaration that someone lived, someone struggled, someone loved, someone suffered, someone hoped, someone watched the moon, and someone somewhere eventually fell asleep. So now, as the last palace lights fade, you can let the story become quiet. The Great Wall disappears into the darkness. The Grand Canal becomes a thin silver line beneath the moon. Chang'an becomes a memory. Nanjing becomes a memory. Hangzhou becomes a memory. Beijing becomes still. The old imperial roads are empty. The books are closed. The brushes are washed. The soldiers have gone home. The merchants have finished their accounts. The farmers have closed their doors. And across the enormous landscape, from the mountains to the rivers, from the northern plains to the southern coast, the night settles gently over the land. The same land that saw empires rise. The same land that saw them fall. The same land where ordinary people kept living through it all. For tonight, there is nothing left to conquer. Nothing left to defend. Nothing left to explain. Only the quiet. Only the darkness. Only the distant sound of wind. And the long, slow memory of an empire that once believed it might last forever. It did not. Nothing does. But it lasted long enough to leave a shadow across human history that still stretches into the present. And perhaps that is enough. The final lantern dims. The palace sleeps. The centuries become still. And the story of Imperial China, after 2,000 years, finally fades into the night.